calls before. So I'm sort of clued in a little last week that there are some there's some parts of the Kenneth Smith philosophical framework that those who've been on these calls enough have heard and are using when they read these essays, but those who haven't been on these calls as much don't know that part. They aren't using it to read the essays, and as a result, they read basically an entirely different essay than the rest of us are reading. And I was thinking about, you know, from some of the arguments we were having last week, well, why is that happening, and what are the pieces you have to have in order to really start to not to understand it the way Kenneth does, because none of us has read enough philosophy and taught enough philosophy to see it the same way that he means it, but to at least be on the same page, we're sort of kind of have the general sense of it. And I made a list of those things, but whether or not we need it, I guess we'll just play by ear, and maybe I'll just always keep that handy for future sessions in case we do. But there's really nothing, I guess, stopping us from diving right into to looking at this.
Well, it seems like last week you also had a couple of Kant devotees. I mean,
Sure.
I mean, so, and that's okay. I mean, so they were hardly defending Kant in a way. So,
yeah, I thought about that because, of course, one of the okay, I'll just put the little outline in the chat, shall I? So that we can kind of see what the core ideas are. Hi, Ginny. So one of them is the mind versus reality, right? And that's the idea that we must never lose track of the difference between what we think and what's real. We must never start thinking that what we think is real, and that things that are real, if we didn't think about them, then they don't exist. There's all these epistemological traps that people fall into all the time. And yeah, Phil.
Yeah, I have something to say about that. I didn't realize you're going to bring it up, but I was going to bring it up in a later moment.
Sure.
Just before I came, I watched some videos on optical illusions. Now I'm familiar with them, but I was refreshed by it. I was particularly impressed by this thing about the oscillating window. I don't know if any of you know this, but if you create a window in a particular way, with a kind of perspective, and you paint the shadow in the right way, and you rotate this thing, and you stick an object. In fact, he constructed one that was like big enough so he could crawl through the window, and you rotate it. It looks like what happens is that as the thing rotates, the window oscillates back and forth, but he keeps rotating and he actually goes through the window. So he explains this by showing several different objects. So therefore you understand what's going on, but your eyes and your mind, which is deeper than your understanding in a way, like refuse to believe it because you're so struck by the system
Yes.
that you can't forget it. And I was going to bring up how that is also true conceptually, and that's why so many people lag behind, because they can't not believe it. It's so ingrained that
Yes.
thing actually creates even so. So even if you see that that's impossible, right? And then what happens? At least if then you could actually conceptually understand that, which means you have to be self-critical. That the liar is yourself. You are lying to yourself.
Yes.
Because you won't believe what the thing is telling, even though you are still gonna lie to yourself. So
yes.
it's not so much other people are lying to you. You are so habituated in the thing that you are lying to yourself, and you can't. I don't believe it.
Yes.
Right? So I
Yes.
think that's the same trap mentally as the optically that's speaking.
Yeah, this is why
Right. That kind of feels like that's an opportunity to get a glimpse of how self is multiple instead of necessarily a one unified thing, or at least two, maybe even more. Yeah. So I definitely understand. Kind of like Mulholland Drive, that movie. There is this famous scene about Club Silencio that that you see these people performing with this beautiful sound, the trumpet sound, and all that coming out. And during the performance scene, the performer actually shows actually what you think it is making sound is actually just coinciding this physical movement, and then the sound came from a different source. So, oh, okay, so they even proved it and shows it to you. So you meant you Lord, or you know that, you know it intellectually, but still when they perform it again, you just cannot believe that it's not a performing from that site, that source of sound is actually coming out from the record. If it all happened in the same unified time, you just cannot help but to believe the scenery or the performance. So yeah.
So that's Jean. Is that Mulholland Drive that has that scene with the Club Silencio?
Yes.
Yeah, I got to rewatch that.
I thought that that yellow dress, blue dress phenomenon a few years ago, that to me, because I have a visual impairment, so I know what I'm processing isn't really reality. But it's just, to me, that just represents like how we all see things so differently, and we can look at the exact same thing and see different colors, and that's just a very simple, that's just a picture. I mean, processing all of the sensory inputs when you go outside, everything is so different just because you have your survival instincts on, and your survival instincts are very different from maybe someone else's, but due to your experience. So to me, that represented this is proof, like we just see things, we can look at the same thing and see something completely different.
Well, the point is that, you have to be a critical person, and the most important thing, the foundation of that, is you have to be self-critical. Because if you know that the system is making you lie to yourself,
yes,
then if you're not self-critical, you cannot actually even argue your way out of that trap. And so those who just sort of accept the situation and not being self-critical, let alone, the thing is, like, you would criticize others, but you're not being self-critical. That is the foundation of the problem.
Right.
And also the society keeps enforcing and so-called proving it to you and everybody else around you that that's the solid reality. So it's not, it's you lying to yourself. The society around you does that. So it's a feeding each other to where it's just the way it is. That's it.
Yeah, it's remarkable the extent to which so many people can't even get through this first epistemological lesson. They treat, cognitive optical illusions as a curiosity while they're looking at it, and then push it out of their mind the moment they're not looking at it, because they're really comfortable with the idea that reality is exactly the way it seems to them, and they really don't want to question that. They want to feel confident and sure about their perceptions, and they get these feelings that they can't quite put into words, of some kind of deep epistemological dread at the prospect of having to embrace the truth that what's in our heads and what's out in the world are two different things. They don't want to look at that problem because it's too awful. But of course, that's the beginning of all wisdom. You can't get anywhere. I mean, that's like the starting gate. If you can't get through that starting gate, then all the rest of the more sophisticated things are not going to make any sense either, because they're all being filtered through a misunderstanding and the belief that what I think must be true. Ayala, and then Phil. Go ahead, Ayala.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself. Yeah, a few remarks. First of all, it goes beyond the optical illusions.
Yes.
The attention factor and the intention factor shape a lot what is registered in what we see. So you might know the very famous video about the chimpanzee in the midst, where people are passing a ball and you're supposed to count how many times. Do you know that? Anybody?
Yes. But go ahead and say it.
Well, no, that is fun to watch sometimes. You guys want to watch it, those that didn't watch it. But the idea here is that what we pay attention to is usually what we see or what we perceive. And all the information that our eyes still see very clearly and do not register in consciousness are lost for us. Because the process of registration goes together with the perception. It follows it by 0.04 milliseconds, so we can separate them. So we only see what we are selectively predisposed to see. And that's a huge problem for people my age. Okay, I can look at my table and I know what I'm looking for and I see it and I don't perceive it. Anyway, so that's one issue. And then come the other, playing the devil's advocate. Well, if we can't trust anything that we see, why not believe all those people who tell you about the green elks, you know, or the aliens, or all kind of conspiracy theories? And why not? I mean, it's all possible, right? If evidence is not reliable. So how do we navigate in life? And we have to find some ways that will make sense, such as maybe probabilities, paying attention to science for some reason, you know, in this, where I live, especially in New Mexico, there is such an anti-science approach. Because we have to live, we have to act all the time on the basis of our senses, very much so. At the same time, we have to be careful. So the thin line in between, Rick, is the billion-dollar question.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That what this does, the framework of the mind versus reality opens up the questions that we have to ask, but it doesn't tell us how to answer them. And there are at least as many bad answers as there are good answers. You know,
Yeah.
we could get lost in solipsistic dreaming and saying, well, anything I can imagine must be true then, so all bets are off. Or we could become really rigid in our thinking and say, only things that I personally have tested are true. And since I haven't tested you, you don't exist. And you're just a figment of my imagination. You know, there's all these different ways to go wrong, and trying to strike a harmonious balance that allows us to more or less deal with reality despite the problem that we have is one of the great epistemological challenges of human beings. Phil, and then Joseph.
Yeah, well, that's why I describe myself as somebody who equivocates, and describe myself as one who live in the borderland. The artist who is like in the city and out of the city, constantly equivocating back and forth. Because in defense of this sort of rigid mind, against the other thing, which is being self-critical, you have to understand that it's even deeper than your intellect in this sense. This was like 40 years ago. I listened to a lecture. I was at Berkeley before I went there, about this perceptual psychologist who did experiments with baby kittens, and which is abhorrent, but nonetheless, it gave information. He took little kittens before they were developed, and he raised them in an environment that's totally horizontal. Everything was horizontal. There was no vertical edges, okay? So after a while, the kittens actually not even think. They do not develop vertical detectors in their eyes, and not by the optic chiasma, which filters what you see. So that just was not developed. It's actually in the brain itself, okay? And so then later on, when they grew up in this totally horizontal environment, he put them in a regular room where there are tables and chairs with a lot of vertical edges, and they just keep bumping into them. Like they literally did not see it. I mean, it's not that they didn't think about it, they just didn't see it. So therefore, there's something already embedded. And this leads me to think that you constantly have to, in a sense, understand that on the one hand, you have to deal with new information about things that are changing, but you also have to construct a realm of understanding in which it fits in. So you always have to equivocate. And if you don't know how to equivocate, then you can't let in new information because the context is already built. But you do not want to lose that context and have everything fall into chaos either. So therefore, in a sense, you have to constantly manipulate. So therefore, if you understand that the system itself that you have built, and it's not totally your fault, because like I said, it's deeper than understanding, then you have to, in a sense, always understand that at the border edges, the city walls grow and you have to expand and understand and bring in the new information. But you're not going to sacrifice the city. You know, I'll forget, I'll just be like a hermit and go live in the woods. And so therefore, in a sense, you always have to know that there is new things coming in and you can't be content just with the thing that you have built, which is orderly, that needs that understanding. I was watching, I was listening to some Egyptian mythology, and on that second level, well, first there was Num, and then there was the celestial cow, and then there was two that was born from the celestial cow, which is essentially a god of order, a primal god of order, and a primal god of sort of like chaos. But that chaos was also part of what is needed, and that chaos was, in a sense, eventually manifests into something else, but it was necessary. So instead of discarding the chaos, it also understand that was the seed for creativity. So Egyptian mythology never eliminated chaos. It was always embedded in that, in a sense. So that was kind of a deep sense. It was not like, oh, we'll just get rid of it because we know chaos is bad. Things, city get burned down, whatever. And so that deep level understanding, and I understand as an artist that, like you need some data in there to disrupt the system so that you got new information will grow in order for it to understand. And I think that it's important for you to understand that part, not so much to let chaos rule, but just to let chaos in.
Right. Thank you, Phil. Joseph, then Sharon, then Priya.
Yeah, I mean, our inability to actually assess reality and is problematic. It kind of gets to the heart what is the issue with what we've been reading with the rationalist perspective. I mean, essentially that you can then make up your own reality, and any rational kind of thinking from there can lead to, devastating kind of consequences. So as Ayala had pointed out, is that, what is to stop us from believing outside forces that are telling us that this is wrong with the world, and then shaping how we behave, are in basically ruining or causing our premise to be off, and our rational thinking is just limited at that particular moment in time. And then you have, on top of it, you add the system itself that perverts thinking. So it's kind of overwhelming when you really think about it, because you're trying to reconcile your lack of ability to perceive the situation and the system itself that you live in that's telling you what's right or wrong.
Right.
And then so coming to some objective realities or objective truth is extremely difficult. And then to apply rational thinking into that, it works to a degree, but it's not to the dogmatic degree, I think, that to what Kenneth Smith's point is. And I think that this is a really good example of how not only how the individual and how the systems themselves make rational thinking so difficult to, as a dogma.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. This is one of the reasons why I put this at the top of the list of the kind of capsule summary of Kenneth Smith items is that, unless all the participants sort of agree that we have this challenge on mind versus reality, it's not going to be possible to understand Kenneth Smith's critique of Kant, because it's based on where Kant goes wrong on that. And it takes a few more steps to get to the point to where we can see how Kant has gone wrong, but that the possibility of going wrong is so omnipresent for human beings, is one of the things we have to bring to our reading of Kant, who's relying so much on the mind's ability to reason clearly and the hope that will lead us to the truth. Sharon and then Priya.
I'm struggling with all of this.
Yeah, shoot.
Because I believe that dedication to reality is the cornerstone
Yes.
of mental health.
Yes.
And even if the reality is painful, it is your search for the truth. And I certainly understand this in the mind or in the context of interpreting Kenneth Smith. But having lived a life where really believing reality is critical and essential, I am having difficulty getting lost in all the what's the word I'm searching for? All the inconcrete stuff.
Yes.
Because I'm very concrete when it comes to reality. It either is or it is not, and it's not your choice to make a decision. Believe what you see.
Right.
And so that's where I come from on this one. But I do understand what you were trying to say about using some of this in the interpretation of Kenneth.
Yeah, this is where the challenge is, because, Kafka tells us in the contest between yourself and the world, back the world. You never, if you think that the world works one way, but the world actually works another way, you're never right. The world is always right. And so, the duty is incumbent upon us to be constantly searching for the truth, and to be searching for where are the places in our mind where we're out of sync with reality, and we're operating according to what we think reality is instead of according to what it actually is. And the idea, just the idea that is a lifelong challenge. When so much of our education is structured around the idea of passing and being done, right? That you pass the test and that proves you're done with the subject and you move on. The idea that here is something you will never pass, you will never be able to move on, you must always work at, because there's always more in yourself to ferret out that's out of sync with reality. There's always more ways to get closer to reality. This can be hard for people who are used to this idea that they can just be done with a task and it doesn't haunt them for their whole life. And you can see why then people might be inclined to try to avoid that task, or to deny that it's a duty for them, and to say, well, I've decided for myself that I'm an objective person. Other people are irrational and I will correct them, but I'm objective. So I can stop searching myself for errors, and I can just start feeling confident and comfortable. Lots and lots and lots and lots of intellectual people fall into this trap in America and around the world. You see it every day, where people just cannot question themselves because they've categorized themselves as being done with the problem of distinguishing between their mind and reality, and they think there's no further for them to go. And so they spend their time nitpicking other people and whether they've got it right, as a way to distract themselves from their own blunders that they're making every day. So this is where Diogenes comes into play too, with the whole, the proper conduct of life requires right reason or a leash. And in his mind, right reason included a leash to reality, that we had to be constantly checking our ideas against reality. So, science gives us an example of a methodology for holding our mind accountable against reality, to be constantly checking and saying, well, have we done our duty, or is this yet another place where we're out of sync and need to adjust our thinking? So I'm with you, Sharon, and I too struggle. Especially, I struggle when I'm talking with people who are extremely passionate, but who have not embraced this idea of the challenge of the mind versus reality. They're not willing to acknowledge that they could be wrong, and as a result, they're wrong about a great many open, obvious things, because they're sitting right there out in the open that can't be true. But because they won't let themselves or anybody else question it, it stays wrong and it doesn't ever get fixed. And then they run out and vote and do all this other stuff, which is terrifying. All right, so we've got a quite a everybody's interested. Okay, I believe Joseph's next. Go ahead, Joseph.
I just had a really quick question.
Yeah, sure.
It's just, so would science then be a principle, a guiding principle in your life? If you can't be objective, for your own reality, you have to have a set of principles then to evaluate yourself, and that's where I come in, and like even just self-evaluating, like I have to have a set of principles that I'm going against that are unbiased. And what do I mean by unbiased? They're not they're unbiased in and of themselves, but they're not necessarily unbiased in the way I'm applying them.
You brought up principles, but you thought it was a quick comment.
Yeah, that was kind of in response to what Sharon was saying. Say his principles is like guiding principles, because it's true. If we can't make this objective reality, like, or that we're trying, objective reality is a way for mental health, and I believe that to be true. But how do you get there? And I think that having a set of principles is the only way to actually get there.
Yeah. But
from there, that's kind of that was the question, like kind of is these guiding principles that have to now, I'm not saying that it gets to categorical imperatives and things like that, but it does get to a set of, things that you have to guide your life. I don't know. I'm a little confused on that. So
well, can I say something, not in philosophical terms? First of all, I think it's a constant process.
Yes.
And the arbiters that you set down, you constantly reevaluate them. A lot of them are circumstantial, and a lot of them sometimes are based on actions of the minute. And I go back to when we were using Kant as one of the philosophers in the ethics committee. The decisions that we made varied considerably based on the circumstances.
Right.
And because people use different arbiters at different occasions to try to resolve the situation. And part of your job, I think, as your self grows, and self-growth and self-discovery is a continuous process until you take your last breath, is to acknowledge it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. That first step, to be willing to acknowledge it, is what makes so many other important things possible. I think I'm gonna call on people in the order in which they have gone the least so far on this call. Ginny just stepped out of the room, so I'll come back to her. So why don't I do Priya and then Jean, and then we'll see where we stand. So Priya, go ahead.
So I think the truth is like going to the moon. Like the moon, like the universe is like expanding. We're not in the same place. So it's about probability, and it's that Newtonian kind of versus Einstein. And I think that this is like the anniversary of today's the anniversary of Niels Bohr getting the Nobel Prize for finding, I think, for quantum physics or his discoveries. And it's like, I think we perceive the world as a Newtonian kind of aspect versus reality, whereas it gets a little stranger in different realms as well. But if I want to go to the moon, I know there's a process, there's a methodology, and it's because I can, get there, but it's constantly moving, it's constantly changing. Like I look out the window, I don't feel like we're moving. And I think it's just, even though that target is always off, we have a lot of different ways from science, philosophy, religion, or experiences of getting to the truth. It's kind of it's almost like you have both feet, like kind of that city and not being in the city. It was discussed earlier, like you have both feet. It's like the world of stability where the earth is not moving, but we know it is moving, and
right.
That perception.
Right. Yeah, good point, Priya. Thank you. I dropped in the link to the 1922 Nobel Prize in Physics that Niels Bohr tackled. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, it's a It's a struggle. And one of the traps that we can fall into along the way is to think that having distinguished between the problems of human subjectivity and the need to be constantly checking reality to make our ideas more objective, if we ever categorize ourselves as having finished the process and correctly, objectively looking at reality now, what happens is we get lost in a deeper level of subjectivity in which we haven't just not thought about whether or not there's a difference between what we think and what's real, but we know that there's a difference. We have gone through part of the process, and now we have concluded that there's nowhere further to go, which now makes us resistant to people pointing out, that there could be more further room for us to develop in. And so there's this challenge as we try to harness our belief system to reality, in doing so in a way that doesn't lead us to closed-minded dogmatism of the kind that, for example, led people to resist the theory of continental drift, even though any 2-year-old looking at a map says, hey, look, Africa and South America fit together. And generations of scientists said, no, thou shalt not look, because we know that's not the case, because the earth is stable and we have decided we are objective. There's a second trap you can get into. This is the noetic Verstand trap, where you mistake, you've done part of the due diligence and you're using that as an excuse not to do any further due diligence. And so as a result, what it means is that at different stages in the development of our relationship to reality, we need to bring more tools to bear and more creative approaches to say, how do we dislodge what's now a cleverer, more creative will to be wrong in ourselves, right? Back when we were just a child, our will to be wrong was pretty naive and could be tripped up pretty easily. But the more sophisticated we get, the more sophisticated the traps we create for ourselves to try to keep from continuing to do our duty. Let's see, Jean, why don't you go next?
Well, most people already said exactly what I was going to say, Rick, and then Priya, and then Sharon. But I still want to say more.
Go ahead.
So yes, I think the whole point is about having humility and the open horizon and knowing or being aware that it's a moving ground. Never, this desire, almost a greed for certainty is, in a way, it is enemy. Yes, it is. There is a goal-oriented minded, and certainty is great at one time, but after that, you should also know that there is another realm, another dimension, another world that we can always infuse out to and get bigger and enrich more and more. So I, like Sharon said, I think it's just until our last breath, we should not have this desire for just, okay, so now we have the answer, and that's that. We accomplished it, and then that's 100% the answer for me and for you and for everybody. So that's the human a fallacy. But also as a human being, I think we could adopt something like a Heideggerian notion of truth to aletheia. It always, strangely, it changes. It shines at one time, and then somehow it changes because our society changed and our time changed. So truth reveals in a different way, and if it changes to a different circumstance, and shines in a different object, different framework, different paradigm, then somehow having the humility of being able to accept that, include into your world, I think that's actually that's what it means to be human. In a way, I think truth can be many different levels, but to categorize in a big way, I could see 3 ways. One is a physical world, so-called physical world, but also yourself, because you have an inner mind. So that's another truth. And also we are human beings, social animals. So the society also has a way to figure out, framing words. So all this navigating between the 3 and even more frameworks, I think that's what it means to be human.
Yeah, I agree, Jean. That's a great point. Thank you for that. Ayala and then Phil. Go ahead, Ayala.
Basically, addressing some things that you, Sharon, addressed, but from a different point of view. a few things. One is it depends which reality we are talking about. Personal, emotional reality is much harder to access and to objectify than, let's say, physics, the pure science, even the soft science. And number two to remember, and that has to do with the certainty point. I'm glad you brought that point, Rick. And that is that our brain has a certain structure of understanding and perceiving things. For example, we always, when we see something, we wonder, where did it start? What made it? Where did it begin? We can't very well accept that something didn't start or didn't end, which is the big issue between creationist and evolutionist, for example. And as much as we know that, we still think that way. We can't help ourselves. Now, to your point, Sharon, of you want to know pregnant or not pregnant, right? Is or isn't, and that's this kind of binary certainty is certainly something that we humans need for decision making. Every little decision in our life, it's based on, do we do it or not do it? However, cognitively, it's the farther things from reality. Reality is never, well, not never, but very often binary. Perhaps in the science we get more clarity. But it's like, you put the 7 blind people around the elephant, ask them to describe the elephant, okay? So the one that will describe the elephant as long and hairy is not the one that's soft and smooth and wide. But that's for anything. Put a cup, you sit there at a table with 3 other people, ask them to describe the cup, you'll get slightly different descriptions. So reality is not so simple to discern as yes or no. And that's a big issue. So certainty is a good safeguard to remember. Even when you feel very strongly about things, and when it comes to values, moral values especially, we have such strong feelings that we regard them as the truth, as the only values that, well, in a Platonian way, but actually, moral relativism has enough epistemological background to lay on too. Where does it take us? I hope to the positive end, which will be tolerance and toleration of other views to a certain point. And yet, when it's morally offensive, it is very important to be intolerant. And that's where reality, again, it is not binary, it is not clear. And we navigate with this uncertainty, but with certain principles that we try, as much as our emotion and ratio and reasoning can lead us to be consistent with the way we feel it works for society, for other people as well as for us. And Sharon, just the last thing, what you pointed is Heraclitus' point that everything is in movement. Everything is in movement. So that's another obstacle. Because when we have a certain understanding, when we form a concept, it becomes static. Meanwhile, reality changes. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ayala. Those are all important considerations. I think Phil, and then I'm going to take us to the text. So Phil, go ahead.
Okay, it seems like the way I see it is reality is so complex. In fact, I'm not even sure whether reality is just simply complex, so deep and so complex, or whether it's actually in another way, just complicated, okay? Complexity means that there is a unity through everything, for all things, and we can, in theory, discover that unity. Complicated means the world actually have pockets of unity and diversity everywhere spread out. So there is actually not a unified oneness, but a multiplicity of its own localized unity, in which when we expand, we realize that, let's say, 10 million light years away, the rules might be completely different. We do not know that. We assume that we live in this local universe, that somehow it penetrates all of it. So that's one thing. But even if it's just complex, it is so deep and complex that as an individual, I'm not now even talking about society, I know that I will never get to the end, okay, of that understanding. I know this. So therefore, I find myself on the one hand as being very Greek. In other words, life for the individual is finally tragic and timeless because you'll never get there. All you could do is be like Odysseus, constantly sailing the seas to find things, and you actually never, except this Ulysses, will never get back home again, okay? So left in that position, then I think myself, and that's why I think myself finally as an artist, is not even getting to the objective, because you're never gonna get home, okay? You'll always be sailing. It has to do with the journey itself. You must be caught up in the journey, because the journey is all there is, because you will never get to the end. You might get further, or you might just swerve or whatever, okay? So the journey becomes something. So in that sense, it's almost as if beyond that achievement of the objective, it really gets back to the Tao in some way. It's like the name that could be named is not the eternal Tao, right? It's like the thing that you could perceive is not the eternal Tao. It's like, so therefore, in a sense, the journey, and how do you take this journey, since you do not know the teleology at the end, okay? That's why I think aesthetics is so important. You got to be the sailor, to sail in the most beautiful way you can at the moment you can. So in a sense, you're guided by what is beautiful to you at that time, and that itself may change, but at least you're there in a sense, and you know that you will be sailing the seas forever. And this is a difficult thing to do, because we are governed on the one hand by the idea of discovery and adventure that draws us to this sailing ship. But we also are guided by fear and security, which wants to say, let's go slower or maybe even stop. So there's constantly, even within this journey, even though it's guided by beauty, there's sort of ambiguity that, like, let's go forward. No, let's hold back.
Right.
And so we are constantly in this sort of emotional turmoil, which is our basic makeup. And so therefore, in a sense, you have to almost sometimes bite the bullet to push forward, because the other self of you is like, no. It's really dark and dangerous out there. So I am constantly in an internal struggle, knowing that eventually I'll never get there to begin with. So why should I just not give up now? But I'm pulled by this adventure of seeing new things and discovery and expanding what I know. So that is where we're left at. And like I
Yes.
said, I am glad that I'm an artist. At least I have like, it's like it's like the metaphor of the Zen archer who shoots his arrow into the darkness.
Mhm.
Is the way he pulls and draws the bow and releases the arrow, and he will never know where it's going to land.
Yeah.
But he is doing it in the most aesthetic way he knows at that moment. So I think that is important as a guiding principle in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this law of unintended consequences that as mortals with only a mortal understanding of a complex cosmos, we may have our plans and our ideas about why we're doing what we're doing and what we're going to set in motion, but we can't fully see where we've shot the arrow. It's only illuminated near us and only in some ways, and beyond that, it goes into darkness and we don't really know where the arrow has landed. It's analogous. There's an element. There's an inescapable element of art to the mortal condition that an artist embraces and tunes up and explores deliberately, but that all of us, even the people who think they are the least artistic and think they're the most literalistic and objective, are nevertheless still engaging in this process of starting things that they don't understand the consequences of. Sharon, go ahead.
Can I put a monkey wrench in all of this?
Please do.
About what's reality and what's real?
Yeah.
I've been glued to this George Floyd trial.
Oh dear, yes.
And as a scientist, I know what's real. And then I am looking at the defense and his imagination. And I find the two very fascinating. So that's my monkey wrench.
Yeah, well, this is the problem. Is it's why we can't rely on any person to tell us what's actual, because every person has a subjective perspective, especially the people who are absolutely sure they have an objective perspective. Theirs is the most subjective. They've ruled out the possibility that there could be any divergence between themselves and reality, and so you see this, and it's one of the weirdnesses of the American court system, of the combative, competitive court system. It's based on the idea that if two people are fighting as hard as they can to do opposite things, then whoever is aligned with, well, of course, this goes back to trial by combat. If we're going to be medieval about it, whoever's aligned with God will be guaranteed to win, which countless medieval combats actually disproved by having, the better fighter win instead of the more virtuous person win. And so we sort of are stuck with that now, where we feel like if we do this kind of mercenary trial by judicial combat, that God wouldn't be so cruel as to allow the liar or the unjust person to prevail, and yet we have centuries of evidence suggesting that happens plenty of times, and it raises the question about what is the epistemological basis for our judicial system. Heraclitus points out what Phil was talking about a moment ago, that the human condition at its healthiest is not a peaceful place, that we are caught between opposing desires and like on tenterhooks, we're pulled back and forth. The desire to feel safe versus the desire to explore. The same person has curiosity in them that leads them outwards, at the same time that they've got, limbic risk aversion that leads them to turn back inwards. And, Heraclitus talks a lot about this idea that what people fail to understand is how opposition, the right kind of opposition, can produce the fairest harmony. That people don't understand how that which is at variance with itself agrees with itself. He says there's a harmony in the bending back, as in the lyre and the bow, in which the opposing forces become something greater than themselves and create the harmony that makes life possible. And so we see that there needs to be some kind of dynamic tension involved, but the problem is most dynamic tensions are not holistic ones. They're not healing, life-giving ones, right? For any one way that you could arrange your insulin and glucagon to keep your blood sugar in sync. There are maybe an infinite number of other possible combinations of forces that would kill you right away or very quickly. You know, it's only certain balances, certain conflicts that lead to harmony in life. And so you got to be able to look at a system like the US judicial system and say, well, just because we've got opposition doesn't mean that we're producing justice. You have to look at what are the conflicting forces involved in arriving at justice and arrange those specific forces and harness them together the right way. You can't just say, let's hire 2 mercenaries and have them go at it and see what comes out the other side. And, you know, part of it is, it seems like in any justice system, there really shouldn't be a place for people who are consciously lying or who are straight up ideologues who have no interest in the truth or justice and just want to win. That really shouldn't even be a part of the process. You should be able to rule people out right away when that's what's motivating them. But instead, that's our whole framework for for the system. You buy yourself a lawyer and surely justice shall result, right? I guess we've all got our
And
fingers
we're
crossed.
not even, and add capitalism onto that. That's just a sure chaos or sure.
Well, because as we know,
huge challenge, yeah.
As we learn in school, right, the profit motive can only lead to excellence and never anything else, right? It couldn't possibly lead to any other outcome than excellence. That's we're not supposed to question that. So Contra Kant. So last time we went through the sections on Hegel and Marx, and we went partway through the section on Kierkegaard. And part of what we're critiquing is in this paper, Kenneth Smith is trying to teach us about Kant, not through Kant's own words, but by how did 5 other philosophers respond to Kant? What were their reactions? And thereby, he's hoping to teach us 6 different philosophers effectively, and get us to see their perspective. This builds off of his core idea of the mind versus reality. And in later sessions, we'll talk about some of the other rungs on this ladder. But one of the core positions that Kenneth Smith has as a philosopher is that there is no one right philosophical position for a mortal to hold, because by definition, mortal perspectives are too limited to include all of reality, not even all the important parts of reality. Reality is vast and complex and paradoxical from a mortal perspective. And so as a result, you need philosophy as a form of polyperspectivalism, as a way to get multiple perspectives on something to help to counter the optical illusions and the cognitive illusions that would otherwise mislead us, right? It's a certain number of optical illusions you can fix if you look at them from a different angle, or if you bring a ruler in and actually measure the things that look like they're different lengths and you discover they're the same length and you go, whoa, all right? You need the additional perspective to correct the flaw in the way that we perceive. And so what he wants, he doesn't, the purpose of a paper like Contra Kant, which I didn't convey clearly enough last week to the Kantian advocates, it's not to defeat Kant. It's not to win, right? It's not for Kant to lose. It's that we get a clearer understanding of Kant's perspective. And that could include having a clearer perspective than Kant himself had. If we can see not only strengths, but also weaknesses in Kant's perspective that Kant was unaware of, but that are intrinsic to that perspective, then we're doing justice to Kant, right? In the Socratic terms, that we have a duty to do justice to the rights of the question before us, right? So what we want to get is to the place where we can start to adopt these different perspectives, understanding what their strengths and weaknesses are. Just like with a toolkit, you know whether to pick up the screwdriver or the hammer depending on the strengths and weaknesses they have for the situation at hand. You want multiple tools, not one tool. You don't want to become the proverbial man with the hammer who thinks you can fix everything by hitting it. And anybody who's a devotee of a single philosopher has become that stereotypical problematic mind. Sharon, go ahead. You got your hand up.
I would like to really endorse what you said, because that's something that I learned over the years, is that you looked at the strength and weaknesses of Kant, his philosophy, in the situation in which you were. And then once you recognize the weaknesses, you were able to decide the applicability of his philosophical theory.
Right. And you got to experience that hands-on by applying it to medical ethics.
Yes.
Where it really mattered what the outcomes were.
Yes.
Yeah. And so this is something I did not say clearly last week. And it's because I sort of skipped past the Kenneth Smithian basics about epistemology and ethics. And we were trying to talk about them without having come to agreement about that. So they didn't know that neither I nor Kenneth Smith was trying to beat Kant or defeat Kant or show that he was wrong. We were trying to better characterize the strengths and weaknesses of his philosophy so that we know when it's a good time to bring out Kant and go, okay, Kant can illuminate this. And when is it a time to go, ooh, Kant's got a problem here. Let's bring somebody else in to light it up differently. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, basically, I look at that attitude as in the same line with constantly we want to question ourselves. Of course, we like ourselves, and my opinion is it's dear and important to me. But have some Socratic mind, the Socratic quest mind, to where also there's plenty of value in questioning yourself or being devil's advocate of yourself against yourself. That's just a great tool to achieve some kind of a balance.
Yeah, it's incredibly helpful, isn't it? So there's one of the fundamental things we wrestle with, we get out of Heraclitus and Hegel, which is the idea that the mind has two completely different modes, two different faculties that we're born with. And these two faculties conceive of the world in two completely radically different and basically mutually hostile, incompatible ways. And one of them is based on the idea of organic order. I guess I'll just jot this down in here. I'm expressing this differently than I have in past calls. Organic order versus mechanical order. And mechanical order is very amenable to logic. It's based on the law of the excluded middle, the idea that things are either true or they're false. Something is either a ball or it's not a ball. This patient is either alive or they're dead. And you can get a long way with mechanical order. You can build remarkable systems. You could build a space shuttle, right, using mechanical order. But there are things you can't represent with mechanical order. There's things in the world that can't be understood from the perspective of mechanical order. For example, living systems. Anybody who's grown up in this century knows that, or has heard over and over, that the body is a machine and food is fuel. Right? Commercials say it, public safety things say it, everywhere there's this metaphor that the body is supposedly a machine and that food is supposedly fuel. And this is based on a mechanistic, interpretation of what a living organism is. But biology doesn't actually support that interpretation because organically ordered systems behave very differently than mechanically ordered systems, as in the example of the cat versus the toaster. You can disassemble your toaster and put it back together again, and it works just as fine as it did in the first place. But you cannot do that with your cat. Your cat biological or organic order has a very different kind of relationship of the whole to the parts, and of one moment in time to another moment in time. Likewise, you can manufacture the parts of a toaster separately and then bring them together to create the toaster. But that is not how any cat or any human being did ever come into existence. We bud and unfold and differentiate and it is through that process of budding and unfolding and differentiating that our parts, which are not anything like the parts of a mechanical thing such as a toaster, come into existence. Our bones were never separate from our bodies. They are the same cells as the cells in our eyes or our brain or anywhere else. They're just differentiated differently. They're expressing their potential differently. They're the same great grandchildren of the original fertilized egg as any other cell in the body is. Just they took a different path. They're all expressions of that whole. And so as a result, the relationship of parts to the whole is under no obligation to obey the rule of the law of the excluded middle. Things frequently have complicated relationships to each other, and the relationships are constantly shifting and flowing, and have to be interpreted differently at different times. The rules for what makes a healthy organic order versus what makes a healthy mechanical order are not only different from each other, they're often directly damaging to each other. If you try to apply the rules of mechanical order to an organic system, you kill it. And likewise, you may not be able to manage a complex mechanical system like a space shuttle if you try to do it, in the ways that you would manage your garden, for example, because the parts of the space shuttle are never going to grow together into a larger whole, and they're never going to heal, right? They don't do that on their own. You have to pay attention to everything. You have to have your checklists, and you have to get all your parts sorted out. So there is this thing here, and this is core to Hegel's criticism of Kant, because Kant talked about thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but he did it in a way that Hegel accused of being mechanical, right? And he said that that's not the way that human beings work. That's not the way the human mind works. That we grow through stages, and those stages are different from each other and can even be hostile to each other. But nevertheless, the later stage grows out of the earlier stage, and their relationship to each other is a lot more complex than any kind of a mechanical schema of order can account for. And he said this is where Kant goes wrong, is that Kant tries to define the human mind instead of taking it as it naturally actually exists in us, in all of its diversity and in its flowing and transformations. And so he says, as a result, Kant only gets some things right, and other things he gets wrong, specifically in that way that mechanical thinking tends to misunderstand organic systems. So Joseph and then Phil, go ahead.
I was just going to make a comment because it seems as if mechanical systems themselves require us to have the same values, whereas the organic systems themselves need to be free-flowing and actually evolving. And so that otherwise you'd be just, and I appreciate your example because this makes it very clear, is that you're jamming like essentially an approach to a space shuttle where you have an objective, where the objective is clear, the value is clear, down onto a garden really just does not work. Right. And it doesn't necessarily work with organic systems as well. So therefore, this is where Hegel's saying that this is kind of, the logic may be sound in how you arrived at your value for the space shuttle, but and this is kind of what you were saying last week, is that it's not that it was wrong that you had come to this value, it just doesn't always apply. And where could we use where could we use other forms of logic in order to integrate into the real, I don't want to say the real world, but essentially the real world, to real world problems like the ones that Sharon was talking about. So I really think that this is ultimately about value systems in addition to a mechanical and organic order, because one, you can distinguish what the values are, and the other one you can't. They're evolving. They're constantly evolving. So there's going to be some conflict. And I think that that's actually made it very clear for me. So thanks.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, and what you just talked about underscores why Kenneth Smith is a value-laden philosopher instead of a objective or neutral philosopher, is that he points out that in all these forms of order and in all the forms of epistemology that go with them, there are inherently value systems. They are saying things about values, and that the longer you engage in one of these forms to the exclusion of the other, the more your own value system adapts and morphs until you become different than you were when you started. You start to become a symptom of that schema of order rather than an author of it. You may have gone into it thinking, all I want to do is build this robot. But by the time you're done, the robot's not the only one that's following mechanical order, because if you don't also follow mechanical order in your management of the robot, you're going to make a lot of mistakes and drop a lot of steps. And so there is this systematizing that happens to you while you're trying to systematize the matter that you're adjusting. And this is another one of the things that Descartes and Kant don't deal with at all, is this idea that if they are using a sort of severely limited approach to thinking about the world because they're emphasizing noesis and turning away from gnosis, it has the result of altering what they're able to understand about the world as well, and what they're able to understand about morality and ethics. This whole dimensions of what's true begin to fade into the background and become part of the ceteris paribus, the all else supposedly being equal. And and the parts that lend themselves to mechanical manipulation or systematic logical manipulation seem to move more into the foreground and become reality itself, even if they're only part of it that can't be understood unless we see its indebtedness to the part that's been suppressed. This is where a lot of the violence is done to our ability to comprehend the world, is just in this thing that we're so good at, that we're all born with this biological capacity to do foreground background manipulation on an instant. Gaze at a scene and immediately the mind pulls some things forward and shoves other things back. We don't even know that we're doing it. And yet even in that unconscious fraction of a second moment, we've made the pivotal mistakes. And that's where Hegel's criticizing Kant. Phil, and then Jean.
And actually, it's related to that. Can I just go first?
Phil first. Phil first, and then Eugene.
Okay.
Yeah, this really brings me back to the very basics of Egyptian mythology. Not that I'm an expert at it. Remember, at the very beginning, before everything, was Nun, which is the celestial sea, the primal sea, I should say, in which it wasn't so much chaos, but it was just sort of like very expensive, very unknowable. And then arise out of that was the celestial cow, which I immediately recognized was, in a sense, the Nile, which is interesting. In other words, it was going to be an agricultural metaphor, right? Mm-hmm. And the celestial cow gave birth to Atum, who was the, I guess, the god of creation, and the first generation of God of creation, and then Epet, okay, and who was sort of like creativity chaos. It was interesting, that tension, because even though Atum sort of like was sort of like at some tension and sort of appalled by Epet, he knew that it was a necessary thing. And Atum eventually gave birth, through his grandchildren, Osiris, and this is as far as I'll go, but Osiris, and then Isis, and Set.
Mm-hmm.
There might be somebody else, but that those are main ones, because he knew that he can't just sort of go ahead and defeat Epet, right, because it was an important part of it. And it was interesting because and he gave Osiris the main duty of governing civilization in an agricultural way. But there was a tension immediately between this sort of Set and Osiris, because Osiris was the organic self and Seth was the mechanical measuring thing. Remember how he defeated, in a way, partly defeated Osiris, was he measured the sarcophagus and got in, he knew exactly what the measurement was, and then he threw him into the Nile and so forth. And I won't go any further than that. It was interesting that these two systems exist because he never destroyed it. And even though Egypt remained an agricultural metaphor and an agricultural civilization, it sort of also honored measurements, because they built the pyramids, they did all these right. things, because they knew that the tension, the coexistence was necessary, even though the agricultural aspect of it, which is through Osiris, was more fundamental, but they never rejected that. I think that's very different. Once again, I don't know the history enough, but the Syrians really much more honor measurements, structure, and so forth. It was very, very interesting how these coexisted, and how the Egyptian civilization lasted so long, because they kind of honor both in a way, even though they gave preference to Osiris, obviously, but it was necessary, this part. I kind of think that, I don't know whether Hegel ever knew about Egyptian mythology, but it was already the foundation, which is a little different from the Greeks. It was kind of interesting how those two biological and mechanical systems coexisted in a way that allowed them to build a world and yet exist in organic nature.
Yes.
So that's as far as I'll go. It was just very, very interesting how it began with the Nile.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
and it gave birth to agriculture, and then this sort of constructive mechanical part. It was a very, very interesting. When I read it, I said, oh, like this is really a kind of mythical grounding for civilization.
and for the creation of harmony by harnessing both faculties of the mind, pathos and poiesis. It's not enough to be a willful ego who goes out and changes the world. One must also, have pathos. One must suffer nature and recognize that one is part of a larger whole that one's not in charge of, and that it's the harmony between the two. It's making sure that the ways that we exert our ego stay within the framework of what's healthy and possible, and we don't overreach, that we're able to create a viable civilization. To build that right into your mythology is a brilliant move, right? I mean, you can see it with didn't Seth cut Osiris into pieces?
Yes, he did.
Isis had to put him back together, and the cutting into pieces is a symbol for the measurement. The shingle and schism and scissors and science all come from the same verbal roots, to cut. Right, they're analysis focused, analytical, and it's because you take the whole and you cut it up into measurable parts, right? Because you can't measure everything at once. Each measurement has to be discrete, and thus you get parts out of a whole. But of course, the other crucial half is the synthesis. What is the organic whole that's formed, and it can't be done the same way that the dissection was done, which is our challenge as human beings, to not let one or the other become the sole ruler over us. Jean, and then Priya. Go ahead, Jean. Oh, and Sharon had her hand up. So Jean, Sharon, Priya.
Okay, going back to what Rick said earlier, and first of all, I apologize for my lack of the deeper knowledge, but my superficial knowledge in Kant says that isn't it the whole point that Kant, his contribution to philosophy is that his book title, Critique of Pure Reason. So he did create a space for both. So the criticism for Kant in that sense, I don't quite understand. Of course, it is lack of my knowledge in Kant, but yeah, I apologize if it was covered in the previous sessions.
No, it's quite all right. There's certain themes we have to return to regularly, and it's one of the things that I cited after last week. I'm going to do on a regular basis is keep bringing us back to some of these core points. And so one of them is this Hegelian concept, which he drew from the Greeks, of gnosis versus noesis. Two different kinds of thought, two different faculties of the human mind that we're born with, and he in German named them Begriff and Verstand, and the idea is that we're born into Begriff. Even as infants, we're just like potent at Begriff. Infants have this live wire connection to their perceptions and their feelings. They feel everything very strongly, and it's hard for them, for example, to do something that happens to me almost every day. It's hard for them to forget that they're hungry and to skip a meal. Baby's going to cry, right? The baby feels the hunger intensely. But what the baby doesn't have is a theoretical framework, an abstract framework for intellectualizing the experiences they're going through, which is why they have to learn everything. They have to learn that vision is not a colorful curtain pressed up against your face, but that there's distance between things, and some of the colors are far away and some are close. As people who never had vision until as adults, they had a surgery that repaired their eyes and allowed them to see for the first time, they were able to tell us in words what the experience is like of discovering vision. And they're like, at first you can't see because you can't interpret what you're seeing. It's just all pressing on you. It's like, it's hard for us as adults to remember that a baby had to learn even how to process something that is for us as automatic as knowing what's close and what's far away. But they don't even have that. Their intellectual framework doesn't include, it's empty of so many things that we take for granted. And over time, struggling through their feelings and sensations, struggling through the experience of begriff, of raw, naked pathos, they rebel against it and they begin developing their Verstand capabilities, their abstracting, predicting, systematizing capabilities. So they can start to say, well, it's a new day. I should probably, maybe today I should like try to get some food before I'm miserable with hunger, right? Maybe I don't have to wait and cry. Maybe I could, try to elicit a response from my parents earlier in the day, and then I wouldn't ever have to go through that. Or like object permanence. Maybe the ball that the parent put behind their back is still there. maybe we don't have to start over with a universe in which there's no ball and then magically there's a ball. Then they can start to plan and predict and to create their world, to shape it. And that act of poiesis, of engagement with and exerting their will upon the world, is how they develop their Verstand and become more analytical, more systematizing, more rational. So what Kant has done is he's taken the beginning that Descartes gave us and turned it up to 11 to really explore this Verstand or noetic capability within us, the ability to systematize and intellectualize and rationalize. And what he's trying to do is create a framework for understanding and for morality that rests entirely on that noetic Verstand side and not at all on the side of begriff or gnosis, because he doesn't trust the unconscious, the unexamined, the traditional. He says those are not good bases for making decisions about ethics or about the truth. So he wants to somehow jettison all of that. So he's like an adult who's gone too far. He's come all the way from the suffering infant to somebody who wants everything to be an act of will and believes that you could make a good world and people who are good and are have access to the truth strictly through using that one of the two faculties we're born with. This is what he's strong at, and this is what Hegel criticizes him for, is having overreached. Priya, you put your hand down, but you had your hand up. You want to go next, Priya? Go ahead. Just come off mute. You're still on mute, Priya, so we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Sorry for the technical difficulties. So just kind of going back to a bit kind of what you were both talking about, like in Hinduism, I find in like Western religions, when you compare them to Eastern religions, and I come from like a Hindu background, we factor in, there's a lot more factorization of chaos.
Yes.
Like chaos has a place. So like I'm like a Hindu Brahmin, so the caste system is a very practical economic way of like, I can say it's like slave, like you basically it's just slavery in another way. But it had practical purposes, unfortunately, which don't necessarily have a place in our society now. But then we also have like a billion gods.
Right.
And it's kind of like looking at a fractal in a way, like reality. Like you keep looking at it and you see a leaf, and then you keep going deeper and you see patterns, and those patterns just keep repeating it, and you can just keep going further and further until who knows when reality completely breaks down. But I find that that we're missing a lot in Western side, that chaos isn't as important or even being factored in. I've actually kind of experienced what the baby is experienced, because I found out about my visual impairment when I was an adult, and I didn't know this, but I have a very poor visual memory. So my memories, all my visual memories are I don't really have them. They're like little flashes, but I thought that was normal.
Right.
And I have my auditory is picked up on that, because I think somebody was talking about the optic part of the brain, like that's where the issue is. So when I wasn't picking up on the visual stuff, my auditory stuff got a lot better. But I had no idea that if I read something, I'm not going to remember it. But if I listen to something, I will remember it, like most of it. And
Right.
I lived most of my I would say 90% of my life up until this point completely different, and then discovering, this is my reality. My reality is very different from everyone else's, and I need to make adjustments in order to fit into their reality.
Yes.
It's kind of felt like you're talking about that child, like emerging and realizing the differences and the little steps you have to take and stuff. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Priya. Yeah, it's one of the interesting things about becoming a teacher is that you discover how many things your peers have forgotten they had to learn, because now they take it for granted. It's their ability to take it for granted that makes them so efficient at what they're doing. So they don't have to think it through anymore. They can just do it in an automated way, and they can put their creativity to other parts of the problem. Like a med student who first comes out of college has to spend so much thought doing things that experienced doctors don't think about anymore that way. And the experienced doctor can look at other parts of the problem as a result, because their cognitive real estate isn't all being burned up, doing these kind of fundamentals that the student sort of has as knowledge but doesn't yet have as experience. It's part of why it's so important for them to go through that process of kind of getting more fully baked in a hospital, going through their residency and internships before that. So
taking it, sorry, it's like when you're first learning something, you're doing it very consciously.
Yes.
But it becomes unconscious, and it's just, you just go into like an automatic pilot, and you don't even think about it. You just drive. Like when you first learn, like I learned standard last year, and that was very difficult. But now I don't even think about it. It's because it's just part of my unconscious mind now. It's not in my conscious part of my brain anymore.
Yeah, and this is what's so interesting. What Dave points out in the chat is that is what Hegel's criticism is of Kant, is that it's natural to be proud of what we have accomplished in our long journey from the infant's mind to the adult's mind. But the problem is that the infant's better at some things, and if we put too much pride in where we've ended up, and we too much discount where we started, we're likely to start to not realize what we've lost along the way, and to fall out of balance. So the ability to really know what you're feeling and to really notice what's happening around you, that infants have is remarkable. And Hegel says that what we want is not to like escape from that, but to reintegrate it, so that we become a third mentality beyond the intellectual, who kind of re-heals themselves and is able to do what Phil was talking about before, where they sort of keep themselves in tension between these different perspectives, and they play back and forth, and they use taste and judgment to try to feel out what's the right tool to use. This basically, Hegel's arguing that Kant is, by emphasizing reason to the extent that he's basically becoming monoperspectival. That he's saying that one perspective is enough for the world. You just have to be rational and intellectual in that, and you'll be done. And Hegel says, well, we were born with two faculties, not one. And evolution is not an idiot. There's a reason why we're born plugged into things so powerfully. And that ideally, the mindset we should be striving for is a polyperspectival mind that's able to modulate between these perspectives. And this is, we maybe a month or two ago, we had some discussions about polytheism. We said, well, one of the advantages that people from a polytheistic background have is it's natural to them to be polyperspectival, because each divinity is trying to get us to pay attention to a different aspect of reality, and to say, what are ethics from this point of view? What is epistemology from this point of view? How does the world seem from this point of view? The polytheist has to be able to shift perspectives and adopt different perspectives. Whereas a monotheist has been training all their life that there's only one right perspective and every other perspective is wrong, and their job is to merge with the one, and then they'll be, perfect. And the problem is, maybe a god can do that, but a human being doesn't have a divine perspective. We're stuck with the mortal perspective, and the mortal perspective is not encompassing enough to be able to perceive everything from one point of view. And so as a result, the only way that we can approximate, if it were true that the truth could be seen at a divine layer from a single perspective that was all encompassing, it's not true at a mortal layer that we can do the same thing. It's one of the differences between what is mortal and what is sacred. And so the only way to approximate such an all-seeing, omnipotent monoperspective is through mortal polyperspectivalism, for us to adopt many, many perspectives and shift between them fluently. And in that way, we start to approximate the ability to see things from all sides. So it's your background, Priya, is highly relevant here. We brought it up in the past from the perspective of how ancient Greek polytheism used to work. And you can see it too sometimes in science. Science is more comfortable with polyperspectivalism because science is often talking about competing models of the same phenomena and trying to work out not just which one is better, but sometimes the conclusion you have to reach is which one is better for which situation. When do we use relativity? When do we use quantum physics? And frankly, when is Newtonian mechanics just fine? So there's this constant kind of going to Mahbub's points in the chats earlier, there's this pragmatism that underlies the polyperspectivalism of science, where you sort of figure out what works by attending closely to the actual world, and that teaches you that as a mortal we have to be able to shift perspectives. I think that perhaps comes more easily to those who grew up in a polytheistic religion than to those who grew up in a monotheistic religion. I don't know. That's just a hypothesis. I think it's Phil, then Joseph, then Ayala. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, it seems to me like the foundation of understanding grows out organically first. In other words, we enter through the middle. I always get upset when somebody begins from top down or even bottom up, because ordinarily when we function as individuals, we say like, could you give me that chair, right? You don't begin by saying like, could you give me some furniture? I mean, like, because it's going to say like,
right.
Well, a chair, like which chair? You know what I mean? And then you have all beginning very specifically. You don't even have to say that chair. You say, give me a chair, So we enter and we go outwards from the middle, both up and down, and spread this way. And it seems to me like even in terms of spatial conception, I know that there's some studies with children in which they first see things not from up close like this, like it's like all these colors, like where am I? Or like from philosophical distance, or even from like far away, like like what is that little ant out there? I mean, it begins with like the mother holding the child, and he begins to recognize the face, and that's the first thing he identifies, like, oh, there's actually something that's normal and regular, right? And so like that's why everybody always cries out for the mother, because like that's the beginning. You begin from the middle and you fold outwards in both directions. And I kind of think that's how it begins. And when you go into, let's say, I guess if you study a lot of philosophy, you could maybe begin at the top. But normally people like what the hell is he getting at? Like you don't begin there, you take them up and then bring them down. And in that sense, I think it's organic. It's not a mechanical process, at least in the developmental stage. And that's important to understand, because the foundation there is like you begin at the middle and then you fold outwards, because we don't begin with germs, like can't see it, right? It's like it folds out. I kind of think that's an important aspect that we have to understand, that conceptually, and sometimes the middle is like put down. Actually, quite often I put it down. It's like, oh, that's just kind of wishy-washy, right? But actually, that's where we begin. That's kind of the doorway to go in both directions, rather than one direction from down to up, the other one from the bottom up. It's like, no, you begin in the middle and then you unfold and you see all the dimensions. I think that's important.
It is, right? It's why all the tragedies begin in media res. A whole bunch of the important action has already happened. We're in the middle of things, and that's where we begin learning. And it was core to Hegel's critique of Kant, that he said Kant was postulating a kind of human being that doesn't exist, who hasn't grown through stages and isn't going to grow through any other stages, but just exists in some kind of timeless intellectual stage, as though that were true when it's not for anybody. Even the most hyper intellectual person who exists still has all kinds of begriff acting in them, whether they know it or not. And you know, that a model of epistemology and ethics really needs to take those transitions and changes into account. The fact that, as you say, Phil, we're in the middle. We're not in some fixed state that we're eternally going to be in. We got a line here. I saw Sharon's in line, but I think Joseph and Ayala come first, and then Sharon.
Yeah, just really briefly, I want to just expand upon a little bit what David had put in the chat with the beginner's mind and the idea of because the interesting thing about the beginner's mind is that what we discussed earlier about how systems pervert our thinking, the beginner's mind is outside the system. So therefore, they're able to evaluate it more objectively, because they're learning a little bit differently. And this is important because they're not as susceptible to just conforming to what is already known. And what happens in mechanical systems, and when you mechanicalize something like school and how you learn, then that can become extremely problematic. And how you come to your own reality, like what is your what is your reasoning that you use in order to come to your conclusions. So you can go to school, and many times, and even you won't hear about, you'll go through an economics curriculum and never hear about Marx or somebody like that. You'll because, and it kind of doesn't challenge what your reality is. Yes. And that's a problem. Yeah. And so the fact that because it's been mechanical, it's mechanical because the value's already been determined what the value is. Right. So universities are like managing towards societal standards, not necessarily managing towards education in and of itself. So I think that this is a really important part of how our premise can be, when you're talking about applying just pure reason to how our minds can get co-opted in this process. And that a beginner's mind, and you could say it's a child's mind in many cases, is extremely valuable. And it's proven to be valuable in the sense of even how they approach their problems. Like there was I'm going to get this wrong. There was a statistical competition in the 70s, I think, where there were a group of statisticians I'm going to get the story too far off, so I'm not going to repeat it. But bottom line, there's a lot of instances where people that don't have a particular background that are able to extract generalized principles and understanding and answer a problem than people that have been aligned with a particular discipline for a very long period of time, because the values have already predetermined, and the principles that somebody's applying from an outside perspective is actually bringing something of value. And I think that that's why it's really important not to and it shows you how the main point here that I'm trying to make in a very roundabout way is that how a system can actually really dictate how you think and how you reason, whereas coming from outside the system actually is extremely valuable. And it's when you haven't been beaten down by the system, so to speak, you're able to offer something and that would otherwise not be able to be realized. And that's the beauty of an organic system versus a mechanistic system.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, no, that's well taken. The beginner's mind is cherished in traditional Eastern martial arts. It's also cherished in Zen studies and Buddhist studies as a way to try to help get out of the trap of the acculturated and sophisticated mind, and to get back into connection with what's actually so. Because we take for granted the reality that our intellectualized mind projects onto the world and think that it must be so, when any beginner, or at least many beginners, would look at the same situation and not come to those conclusions at all and see other possibilities there. And so, if we want to free our minds from the trap that we've been acculturated into, we have to, one of the ways to do that is to retrace our steps back to the beginner's mind, which is a perspective from which we can see things that otherwise we can't perceive. Yeah, I'm all over that.
And just one quick thing, and that's the beauty, is that you never know where wisdom's going to come from.
Right.
That's a really, and if you take that principle, it actually helps you interact with others.
Yes. So Ayala and then Sharon. Go ahead, Ayala.
Yeah, and again, to go back to Joseph Beginner's mind in a minute, but the issue with that Kant skipped was that, first of all, what is rational thinking? It's debated, but most people would think, I would say, that it's getting from point A to B in the fastest or most effective, cost-effective way. Now, if that is the reasoning, the process of reasoning, which would be using logic, using, let's say, non-emotional factors, still, the point A and B, or the concepts themselves that precede the process of connecting them into some kind of thought, they are very debatable. And we go back to two positive ideas here, constructive ideas. One is Joseph's, the beginner's mind, and another was the poly-exposure, or when you talked about polytheism, the ability to jump or to move from one point of view to another, or to see a variety of point of view that will give you not objectivity, but some kind of an intersubjective ability to evaluate a thought. Now, Joseph, the best example is with the blind person, a person who was born blind, and after, let's say, 30 or 40 years, they found a way to give the person full sight. He's opening his eyes, and he looks around, and there are tables around and chairs. All he sees is patches of a color that people call brown, lines that go this way, that way, but he doesn't see a chair or a table or any other. So the automatic way which we conceptualize, we form concepts of what we see today is based on what experience, on the way we are socialized, where we grew up, and what we were told about this thing on which we put plates and glasses that's called a table, and it's usually shaped square and so forth. So the advantage of a fresh look or a beginner's mind is that it's yet not polluted and not corrupted yet by information, which tends to solidify. And then if we have those concepts and superimpose on them rational thinking, we are still in that paradigm that we are enslaved by. Those are paradigms that we already have, and the same thing with moral values. So yeah, that's the poly exposure is really, really helpful, at least at getting more than one perspective. And in psychotherapy, which I do, most of the time, what we try to beat out of a person ineffective way of relating to themselves and to life is that they are committed to the past in terms of their memories, which are skewed and reconstructed from the past, and paradigms that were installed by who knows who.
Right. Right. So that they're not actually interacting with or perceiving the present either of the world or of their own feelings. They've got these layers of interpretation on top of it that's causing them to see something different. Yeah. The great
Right.
power. So Sharon and then Phil.
So may I return to the text?
Please.
Because I think part of the text pretty eloquently states what we're discussing here. I'm on page 195, where, and may I read it?
Please.
It says, Kierkegaard grasped that Kant's formalism was completely overlooking the most vital issue of all in ethics, how humans culture or transform themselves to see and control themselves in ethical ways in the first place, and how they depart from what they are or have been as the products of nature and begin to shape and saturate themselves with their own will. As he understood it, how the process of spiritualization or true individuation takes place. Yes. I think that's what we're talking about here, the beginner's mind versus the experienced mind. And I don't think, I think we need them both, because everything is a process and along a continuum. And we're talking about orders. I think one of the things about an organic order, this ability to grow and change and interrelate. A mechanical order can interrelate, but it can't grow and it cannot change. And I think the best practical application for that is you try to fit an artificial limb on a child. It may function well for a while, but as he grows and gets older, you have to change it. That's a mechanical device. Whereas if it's organic, if he had his real hand, then none of that is necessary. That's just my abstract thinking. But I think this paragraph here, this third paragraph here, just really encapsulates what we're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. That once again, you did that thing. There it is. This is Kierkegaard speaking on this very subject, right?
Yes.
And you know what's interesting is that while Hegel critiques Kant by saying, "Okay, you missed a stage or two," Kierkegaard says that doesn't even go far enough. You missed all kinds of stages and they all have relationships to each other. He tried to take Hegel to the next step and lay out all these kind of different stages that people can go through in the process of spiritualizing and ethicizing and you know, and so on themselves, and how each one of those minds thinks about the world and perceives the world differently than the other mind does, as his attempt to basically completely refute Kant's model of a single human mind capable of a single set of epistemological or ethical duties. And he's saying, you know, basically in a nutshell, he's saying if you don't understand how minds grow and develop through stages, you really don't have any business saying how ethics or epistemology works or ought to work, because you're not dealing with actuality yet. That the actual human can be the only basis for a solid epistemology or axiology for ethics, and you know, that's a pretty serious critique. You know, part of what we could take away from it, it's not that Kant was wrong per se. It's that he overstepped. He deeply characterized one stage of the mind's development, and he did a great job at it. Except that he saw it as a universal mind instead of as a stage of development. And so as a result, he doesn't see its relationships to a larger whole that we grow through. But otherwise, yeah, Kierkegaard nails that. Phil and then Joseph.
Yeah, I even wonder about the universality of something, because I mentioned that before between complexity and complicated. Because if you study intellectual history at all, and I'm not a mathematician, but it seems to me the grounding for a lot of it, whether you talk about Egypt or India or China or Western civilization, is based on numbers and mathematics. Like, let's take a Pythagorean theorem, okay? It is amazing how it works, okay? So I have to admit that that's true. But I wonder if flat space, which is calculated in, does it work in a curved space, as Einstein described it, or even more particular, a warp space? What is to say that we're not living in a local phenomenon? And I mean local, I don't mean like, Texas. I mean like a little farther local. That, yes, we are living in fairly flat or even slightly curved. And so the Pythagorean theorem still works pretty damn close. How about somewhere, let's say 10 million light years away? Well, I guess not 10 million, but let's say 3 million light years away. How about the influence of bodies that warp space in a very twisted way? Does Pythagorean theorem work? Does Euclid work? Does any of these mathematical calculation actually work? Or are we worshiping a local god that we try to despise because we want monotheism, a total god that rules over all the other gods? I mean, then I wonder if we build a system that's based on a local god, does that actually hold in a way? Or we just sort of how should I say, just too localized, and we're not truly cosmopolitan in an even broader way? That's why I wonder, even in terms of our understanding, because we presume that it is universal, and I'm not so damn sure. If that is the case, then how is it that we could presume that some universal law, even in the world, could be projected in the way, and irregardless of the development, not even organically, but just say the development of something, that it is not warped in some peculiar way in another culture? So I even wonder on that level, as much as I admire, God, these numbers do fit. They got a point. I mean, they really have a point. It's hard to argue with that point, but is it just localized? That is a very important question that we don't question, because the numbers work. We don't care what theory you have, but the numbers work. And that would be the fundamental argument they have. And it's hard to argue, except but is that a localized phenomenon?
Yeah, this is why it's interesting the way that Hegel characterizes these stages of development, the way that he does. As he says, Begriff, the state of immersion, the naive, direct connected state, is a state in which we are focused on the concrete particular. It's particular because it's not widely applicable. It's about this situation right here, right now. But it's concrete because it's not full of abstract ideas about this situation. It's really plugged into the details of the situation. It has a high reality quotient or a high actuality quotient, but it's not widely applicable. And the infant's probably crying for a reason, and it's probably a highly motivated reason. And the rest of us, if we ignore that, are missing out on something really important. And the infant's probably right. There's something that matters here. But as we grow out of that from the Begriff mind into the Verstand mind, we universalize at the cost of abstracting. So we start to have ideas that apply more widely, but they have a whole lot less density of rich actual information. We start to be able to generalize. And in that generalization, not only comes the ability to talk about things more broadly, but also the ability to be prejudiced. right? The bigotry and totalitarianism and genocide, all of these things flow directly from the abstract universal, because we start dealing with people not as they actually are, but as we have abstracted them into our system of thought. They stop being real in themselves, and they start becoming a kind of real that we have designed, a fake real that's divorced from reality. And so this is the way in which Hegel critiques the limitations of the Begriff side by side with the limitations of the Verstand that Kant loved so much, is to say, see, each of them is getting part of this picture right and part of this picture very wrong. And it's why you can't settle for either one of them. And that what we're striving for, but that there's no easy path to, is to be able to universalize while still being able to be concrete. A way in which we could talk about broad swaths of reality in a way that's still accurate to the rich density of concrete specific details that make each thing what it is. And that's like a paradox. As long as we think within the terms of Begriff or Verstand, it's impossible. I mean, each one claims to be, the source of all virtue, and it claims the other one is the source of all vice. Or if it's willing to do anything beyond that, it still wants to see the possibilities as being a linear spectrum that you can only be somewhere within. The idea that you could break out of that and think at a new level of thought in a way that applies the strengths of both of them to try to counteract the weaknesses is something that is inexpressible in Kant. It's what Hegel says. It's the critical error of Kant that he makes by missing the other things he misses, is that he fails to understand that that Verstand can't possibly be the end goal, that it has to be a stage we move past because its problems are just that we can't survive its problems. We need to move on to that next stage, and that next stage is everything. That's the level at which we're going to be able to do the things that need to be done without doing all the terrible things we don't want to do as side effects of those. It's the only way to resolve the paradox. Sharon and then Joseph. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm just reading the text here.
Yeah, please.
And there's the term, the basal metabolism of personality versus one in which there's dynamic and self-evolving power.
Yes.
Right? It says Hegel and Nietzsche recognized that, and they thought that Kant thought that personality was so basic, and that would be the problem in his approach to ethics. Am I getting that right?
So what he's talking about here is he's using the Hegelian framework, which Kierkegaard built off of. His idea is that Begriff, or the concrete particular, or gnosis, or put another way, soul, is the basal metabolism of personality. Because the thing that you're born with is the ability to feel like a whole. You both feel like a whole yourself, and you feel intensely your connection to the larger whole. So the larger whole feels like a whole. You're not separated from it as a piece. It's why you cry immediately. It's why you stare in wonder immediately. It's why you do all these things. You're so plugged into it. You make a whole. But the process of learning to abstract, of getting control of oneself, of being able to be willful and to make choices and to shape yourself as a conscious act, as an artist of yourself, as Kierkegaard describes it, the cost of that is that you lose the ability to form wholes. You stop feeling like a whole yourself. You start to feel like a bunch of parts, and you stop being able to see the entirety of the cosmos as a whole, because at least you start to see yourself as separated from it and as a willful actor who's trying to shape the world to meet your desires, right? And that if in no other way, and there are countless other ways, but if in no other way, merely the desire to separate your intentions from what's actually happening and to shape what's actually happening, to submit to your intentions, by doing that, you have split reality so that you're separated from it now, right? At a mental level, you've created a schism, a division, and reality is no longer a whole. And the more that you learn systematically, this is a tree, that's not a tree, this is a cat, that's not a cat, the more you chop up reality into all of these parts that are amenable to systematic logic. So the more we learn and the more we intellectualize in a Verstand noetic way, the less we're able to form wholes, and the more wholes seem to collapse into parts. And that's what lends itself to the mechanizing mind. So this is what he's talking about when he says that what Kierkegaard is doing is he is scrupulously ignoring, and ignore isn't even a strong enough word. He's scrupulously suppressing discussion of the sub-rational parts that make your mind possible in the first place. He doesn't want to talk about your emotions. He doesn't want to talk about your preconscious or your unconscious. He doesn't want to talk about anything that doesn't submit to sort of rational authority. And he wants to somehow make a way to explain the world, the mind, and right and wrong without admitting that those things exist at all. And he's doing it because he thinks it's good to do that. That's why he says scrupulously. He's rigorously, deliberately trying to exclude from consideration all of these things without which you never would have been able to become an intellectual in the first place. Because none of us starts that way, right? The intellect grows out of that basal metabolism that Kant is now trying to like not look at and not talk about, and let's not explain anything in terms of that. Well, how can you not explain in terms of how you actually got here? That's like trying to explain an oak tree without ever mentioning an acorn. It's in you. The things the acorn was going to do are still happening in you. They're still unfolding in you. And to create a model for yourself in which there's no acorn and there's no growing and you've always been an oak is just, it begins with a lie. It's a kind of escape. As your first a priori position, let's imagine that I'm an intellect and I've always been an intellect and I'm always going to be an intellect, and that all people are intellects. That's what he means by this sentence. Is he's saying, the problem is the intellect wants to think it can explain everything, but the more strictly intellectual it is, the less it loses the ability even to explain itself, because it is a whole and it's part of a larger whole, and neither of those things is something the intellect does well at all. The basal metabolism of personality that Kenneth Smith talks about is the capacity to feel like somebody and to feel a relationship to yourself and to the larger whole, and that feeling level and perceptual level motivates all of the things that we think and make decisions about. So trying to cut it out of the picture is it's like eliminating why anything matters from the picture. We've discovered this in trying to model AI. If you try to make a model of the human mind in a computer, you try to model it where all it has is information and decision making, you end up with something that can't make any decisions because it has no reason to. What makes us decision makers is that we care. It's that whole non-intellectual level of drive and emotion and feeling that leads us to think the things we do, that motivates us.
Yeah, the intangible. Yes.
Exactly. It's the great engine at the core of the human personality. It's the metabolism that drives every cycle through the brain that says, what should I pay attention to? What should I think more about? What should I act on? All that stuff is driven by, how do I feel about this stuff? And so when we take that out of our models, our computer models of human minds, we're left with a computer that can't decide anything because it just doesn't care. It literally can't care because we didn't model that part of the mind. And that's what Kant's done. He's trying to make an ethics. He's trying to make a system of right and wrong in which caring is not actually part of the equation. We don't know how to do that.
So therefore, Kant doesn't see the human as a dynamic and self-evolving power, because that's the contrast there.
Right. Right. He sees the human intellect as a fixed state that we begin with. We begin talking about epistemology as intellectuals. We begin talking about right and wrong as intellectuals. This is what Kant says, because it would be gross. It would be untrustworthy and gross and icky to talk about, it from the framework of things that don't lend themselves to intellectual analysis. If we start talking about, well, we just do it this way because our culture has always done it that way, then Kant breaks out in hives. He's like, no, you have to explain it.
Yeah.
You can't just do things for that reason. They have to have intellectual reasons, rational reasons.
So I don't want to metabolize this, but I found this whole commentary on Kierkegaard very interesting, because he said that what Kant did was very pernicious, and there was a hybris implicit in Kantian ethics. So can you explain that? Hybris, hybris.
There it
I
is.
looked up that word. It's on page 195.
Yes. Kierkegaard saw, as Nietzsche did, what was so pernicious about the hubris implicit in Kantian ethics. The fact that it abstracted our status as ethical colleagues or peers away from our indebtedness to nature and to divinity. So what we're talking about here is one of the strong suits of the Begriff mind, and the mind that still remembers the Begriff mind, the gnosis, is that it recognizes that it's not a God. It's part of a larger whole. It came from larger wholes. It's not going to be around forever, and it's rife with limitations, right? Nature, when nature is an authority above us like it was in the ancient world, what we're recognizing is that we suffer nature. This is the pathos term, that we are subject to gravity whether we like it or not, that we were born whether we like it or not, that we came from a more infantile state to the current state that we're thinking in, whether we like it or not. Those are out. They're not subject to debate. They're not amenable to intellectual scheme. We can't disprove those things. They're true whether we like them or not. And so there is this whole element of our indebtedness to nature and to deep principles that we don't understand and that we didn't agree to. Right? There was no social contract where we sat down and said, I agree to be born under the following conditions if I'm allowed to make the following choices. We were just thrown willy-nilly into the world, you know, and whether we and most of the things that made our life possible were not up to us. We didn't get to choose. What Kant's trying to do is to factor God and nature out of the equation and put the human intellect as the sole arbiter of right and wrong and the sole arbiter of truth. And in doing so, it is deifying the human mind and claiming that it has the powers that nature and divinity do to create us and to create a sustainable world, when in fact we have actually no evidence of that at all. This is what he means by the hubris, the pride, the overreaching pride that loses its balance in relationship to God and nature, that forgets that we are in fact subject to things larger than ourselves, that forgets that we are not gods in that sort of Old Testament monotheistic sense of the word. You know, when the Old Testament says, in the beginning was the there was the logos, right? God's logos was right there at the beginning, creating things. The word, the thought, the reason of God made everything possible. For Kant to dethrone God and nature is basically, implicitly, to assert that in the beginning was the human mind, and the human mind decided what was true and what was right or wrong. And in so doing, whether he's willing to admit it or not, he is actually, deifying himself. That's what he means by the hubris. There is this
Can I just interject for a minute?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, that in that way, his mistake is that he sees the human mind as not as part of the human, which is or human nature, which is a part of nature.
Right.
We are a part of nature, and again, whether we like it or not, it just is.
That's right. Thank you, Ayala. That said it more clearly than I did.
Wait, I just also want to make a very, very quick comment about what you said a little bit earlier.
Sure.
If the human babies came out all knowing and developed, could you imagine how boring that would be? I mean, yes. Babies are so absolutely precious because they are so undeveloped. And anyway. Okay.
Yeah, it would be sort of horrifying if we were born as all-knowing, perfect intellects right out of the womb. Many things in life would just be appalling. So we got a lineup here, and I don't remember what order that people got in line. Does anybody? Joseph, go ahead.
Can I make a quick comment? Yeah, because I think this is like just to build on what everybody's been saying. Is that not only that Kierkegaard kind of gives a whole framework for this. Yes. And as to why this is like, and he could, what is it, the night of resignation. It kind of gets to what Phil was talking about, the idea of local knowledge. Like you're resigning yourself to reason within this perspective of the world, this human like the human mind itself, so that you're inevitably not going to be happy with the results of that. And it's not going to give you the right answers. But then this is where he comes up with this whole idea of night of faith. And his night of faith supersedes the human mind. Now, whether you believe in the night of faith or not is kind of irrelevant. What he's saying is the limits of human reason are in this framework will give you results that that you just don't want. And I think the other thing is that he provides you a whole other host of reasons, like how you can suspend ethical decision making within this framework, because you have this faith. Now you have this faith in God, and this is the reason why you can, and you'll be in fear and trembling, and therefore it'll take you through this fear and trembling. But the idea that there is a universal, if you reject that, then all of a sudden then you can suspend logic at a certain point in time, and that's what allows you to make decisions that would otherwise be much more rational, seemingly not rational, much more humane. I'm trying to, much. Not, I don't even know if humane, better decisions than you would if you were using just pure reason. So the framework that he provides is like very clear, and he talks about the whole double movement and and how this night of faith. But this idea of how it allows us to kind of, it doesn't give you a framework to make decisions for everything, but it shows you the limitations on reason alone in Kierkegaard's framework. Right. Like, and that's the beauty of Kierkegaard, that it really shows you if reason is your highest form of being, you're not going to be very happy with the outcomes.
Yes.
You're going to be, in fact, and in fact, you're actually surrendering yourself to yourself in a way. Right. And so the fact that you're making yourself a god in that process. So therefore, you better go get a god outside of that. Right. I mean, so I'm not saying who it is, but what he does call out is something very important, is that we have limitations. Right. Right. And he provides the whole schema, and then he gives us reasons as to why there isn't an there's not an absolute duty to human values. There's an absolute duty to something else, right, bigger than ourselves. And that gets back into the idea of the soul and the spiritual aspect of things, what you were talking about, what makes us up as human, that really can make us human, as opposed to just pure reason making us human. Anyway,
that's well put. I mean, Kierkegaard is trying to refute Kant specifically by showing the limitations of Kant's system if you take it on its own terms. That as you say, there's one way to put this, in scientific evolutionary terms, is that our intellect did not evolve in a vacuum in which we were creating universes left and right by going, let there be light, let there be truth, let there be right and wrong. We didn't evolve to do that thing that we see Yahweh doing in the Old Testament in Genesis, and but that somehow we are craving to mimic or emulate. We don't have the capacity to do that in a sustainable, healthy, ethical way. And it's not even, as Heraclitus says, it's not even healthy for us to want those sorts of things. What we evolved in was a world in which there are things bigger than we are, greater than we are, more important than we are, longer living than we are, more sophisticated than we are. And in the sense in which nature has intelligence baked into it, things that are more intelligent than we are, and that we need those to aspire to and to guide us, because that's actually literally what our brain evolved into being able to be sane at. And as long as we do that, we're tethered to reality in the way that we were evolved to be able to think effectively. But to the extent to which we try to jettison nature or some other greater good as a source of meaning or right or wrong, the more we get into trouble because we start to venture into territory we never evolved for. And what happens to us when we don't have awe and wonder and respect for something bigger than we are isn't good, as we've demonstrated over and over in the 20th century in methodical, systematic, and world-shaking ways, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and then again, this is what carries us through life. You know, if it's just pure reason, well, then, you know, we start to, not that reason's, you know, bad thing, but but if these are the things that a higher ideal, you know, that we're striving for, you know, and that's the difference between otherwise. Like, anyway, that's just a thought. Thanks.
It's good. Thank you, Joseph. I'm going to do, I think, James, then Priya, then Phil. So go ahead, James.
Yeah, this idea of the elevation of reason. Doesn't this go back to you know, Plato? You know.
Yeah.
But it, you know, culminates probably with Descartes, and then there's the demarcation of the self, brings the idea of reason back to the self, as opposed to, you know, be somehow a fundamental principle of order for the wholeness of being, right, of one's being. But then Kant, you know, takes that and tries to use that idea of reason as the highest, you know, authority for the self, but he's trying to put the pieces together without this kind of pre-established harmony that maybe Leibniz had and maybe Descartes had, because Descartes at least, you know, finally submitted that a reason to, you know, to God, right? And God was able to, offer that pre-established harmony. So Kant, you know, tries to put these different faculties together to form the self, right? And perhaps, you know, I don't know if he might have been a major influence on Kafka. Did Kafka ever mention that he was talking about Kant when he was writing?
Oh, sure.
Or did? But anyway, but he probably, you know, definitely, Kant probably definitely had an influence on the Romantics, right? With the response by Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So is Frankenstein kind of the model of what maybe Kant was trying to do by putting together a human being with these different parts, you know, right?
I think she's brilliant to have written that the way she did, because she gave us such a potent metaphor for the misunderstanding of the human whole, the belief that it's just a bunch of parts that you sew together and zap is like, it's the perfect caricature that captures the essence, you know? Right.
So I thought that was interesting. I came across some articles, you know, that made that point too. But it occurred to me, you know, one morning when I woke up, that maybe this is one way to think about Kant, you know, to understand Kant, what he was doing. And I went on Google and found a bunch of articles, and but it was interesting that, you know, that kind of what Mary Shelley did was just probably brilliant, and probably was a response to Kant, you know.
Yeah.
And maybe also, you know, but Kant probably represented the kind of a scientific way of thinking about the self, right?
Yeah. Yeah, he was trying to systematize it.
Right.
And especially when we read Kant as a response to Descartes, you can see his frustration with Descartes' limitations. He's like, that's not even remotely sophisticated enough to be a basis for epistemology and axiology. And that's why he then says, I'll take it on, and I'm going to do it right this time. And, you know, by God, we really are going to found everything on reason. By God, I say, but of course he didn't mean by God. So, you know, he was doing his best to do a thing that, you know, somebody needed to explore. It's questionable whether we even could have had Hegel and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Marx and the rest of these if Kant hadn't gone in and tuned up what it means to be a Verstand, a noetic intellect, because that gave us one of the essential models that we needed to understand who we are. And of course, part of what we're missing now as moderns is we don't have a corresponding model for what it means to be a Begriff Nozick, whole. What does it mean to be plugged into the world completely? We're in these discussions, we're using the infant as a model, but of course, there's more to the Gnosis and Begriff than the infantile. That's just one state of the Gnosis. And maybe somebody at some point is going to tackle that problem for us and do for Begriff what Kant did for Verstand. Priya, and then Phil.
So when I read Kant, I always think of the color beige. Beige is a very important color. It shows up a lot, but I feel that we're missing a lot of, there's a lot of colors like from nature, and that's whenever I read Kant, that's what I think. And this is a quote that gets attributed to Einstein, but I'm not sure if he actually said it, but he says that, it's the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant. And we've created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift.
Yes.
I think in our society now, it's almost become too rational in a way.
Yes.
And we're and life happens, like the joy of life happens in the irrational, a lot of the times happens in the irrational. Like there's nothing, maybe there's some things maybe irrational about eating ice cream, but I love ice cream. It's not good for me. It's going to shorten my life. If I stopped eating it, I probably would live longer, but I love it. It brings me joy and brings me happiness. And I find a lot of the choices, and especially people make, are not rational. They tend to be irrational. They have a very structured life, a grid life, and then they make decisions where they completely blow it up and do something else.
Right.
But that's where we get pushed. That's where science gets pushed. That's where math and physics and engineering. It's at that it's at that kind of line of the irrational and the rational,
where they come together.
Yeah.
Right, because the desire to know, why did I want to know this thing? Why is this what I'm doing my experiments on? We're driven by those desires, and that's what leads us on to be curious about the world and to investigate it. If we didn't have that, science would be totally different than the way it is. It'd be a pretty dull affair if all we were doing was mechanically checking off theories off of lists. But instead, somebody gets passionate about something and they go out and they want to learn about it. And, yeah.
Well, it's like in society, you need people. You don't want everyone to be a change maker because society would collapse. You need people that follow the structure, the rational stuff. We need that stability, the infrastructure in order to do the creativity, be creative, in order to go, creative in art, math, music, science, whatever. And, but we need that structure underneath. So that's why I think Kant is very important, because he establishes that, and he kind of the importance. But again, I feel we're kind of talking about just a few colors here, and there's a whole rainbow out there, a whole electromagnetic spectrum out there.
Yeah. I like that. I like that metaphor. One of the things we talk about the Verstand mind, the noetic mind, is its tendency to slip into the law of the excluded middle, and it likes the law of the excluded middle because if things are either true or false, then there's all these great tools of logic you can use to help sift out what you should believe, what you should not believe, what you should do from what you should not do, what's right from what's wrong. But the problem, of course, is that then you end up with a black and white world. It's kind of the equivalent of your beige. And it leaves out so many of the things we actually care about, like our dreams and our aspirations, which are neither true nor false, but they're the things that are making us want to find out about the true or false. If we create a palette for describing the world that omits the part that matters, we end up with this interesting existential situation that Kierkegaard talks about. One of the things that Kenneth Smith talks about in other papers, but not this one, is that part of Kierkegaard's critique of Kant is that Kant fails to understand something a lot of intellectuals fail to understand, which is that the more you intellectualize your life, the more you're prone to depression, and the less you can motivate yourself to do anything, because you're insisting that the part of life that all of your joy and wonder and motivation comes from doesn't matter, and you're suppressing it. And all you're left with is this capacity to rationally, systematically do things that you don't actually feel like doing because you've lost touch. And I say this as somebody who went through this stage. On my dad's side of the family, where there's a strong, overly intellectual bent. And Kierkegaard dissects this beautifully, following up on Joseph's comments. As part of his critique of Kant, he goes through and describes the ways in which the aesthetic personality, having gained control over itself, having become the author of itself so that it can make itself do whatever it wants to do, has tragically and ironically lost the ability to want to do anything in particular. And so they become desperately subject to their moods. They hope that they're in a mood that will make them be productive so that they can use all these great intellectual tools they developed. But when they're not, they're just adrift at sea, the doldrums, unable to do anything.
There's virtue in just being.
Yes. Yeah, the virtue in being, the attachment to our feelings and our perceptions is what makes the infant such a live wire, so alive. And the more we detach from that, the more dead we become, sort of soulishly dead. We become sort of spiritually alive in that we can move and decide, but we become soulishly dead in that we don't particularly want to move anywhere or decide anything in particular. And these are the horns of the dilemma that we get hoist on if we insist on being stuck either within the Begriff modality or within the Verstand modality. Phil, you're next.
Yeah.
And then Sharon.
My comment has two parts. The first part, it seems to me, the will to power and caring are both organic parts of ourselves.
Yes.
The second part is this, like Kant, in a sense, was trying to save Plato, but he didn't understand that Plato was about the forms, but the forms always remain somewhat mysterious and perhaps even mystical. It was an aspiration that was never arrived at in sense, okay?
Yes.
And then Plato, in a sense, not Plato passed it down, but St. Augustine is very important in this equation.
Yes.
St. Augustine took Plato's forms and instantiated in the mind of God. And the mind of God, through the illumination of God, gives that to the mind of man, okay? So that connection always creates a hierarchy of the endpoint of the total understanding. And that when he was trying to save Plato from Hume, who was just drifting, then he, I think unwittingly, in a sense, was actually instantiating St. Augustine, but eliminating God and having reason as pure reason as part of that. And so in that sense, you created a world in which the tension was between pure reason and care. And the problem with that is this: for those who, with the organic power between care and the will to power, if you are a person that did not care, or at least did not care very much, then the will of power will separate you to, in a sense, take this structure, take this hierarchy and dominate. And those who do care want to maintain a system of caring and a caring for the system itself as well. So you end up with the world of Kafka.
Right.
In which power, in a sense, it created a structure. It wasn't between, let's say, absolute reason. Reason created a structure for power to take over from care.
Yes.
And then we end up with those who actually did care end up being a cockroach.
Yes.
I thought that metaphor was
yes, I remember that.
Yes.
That metaphor was interesting because now that they're alienated from the system, the alienated in the sense from care that can't be put anywhere. So what the thing at Rwanda, I remember the term cockroach.
Yes.
I said, wow, did somebody
Yes.
read Kafka? I mean,
does everybody here know what he's referring to? The thing about the connection between Rwanda and the term cockroach?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Go ahead, Phil, spell it out. Tell them about it.
Well, I forgot which tribe it was, but one of the tribes dehumanized the other tribe by just calling them cockroaches, right? Cockroaches, one of those insects is that I have this dread and disgust with cockroaches more than ants or any other insect in a way. So in a sense, it's reduced to a lowly thing, certainly not human, but just the most lowliest of beings, right? That you ought to wipe out. And that gave it permission to go and destroy these non-human cockroaches. And that's the lack of care, because now you have a tool of, in a sense, of eliminating, because they're no longer human.
Right. So
if we did not care, then we could actually reduce human beings to other beneath our contempt. And so I think, although Kant was trying to nobly save Plato's forms, he left out the mystery part, and he instantiated the godly part.
Yes.
In a sense that allow the will to power to rise to the power of God, and then you have the true displacement that he did not understand that he was displacing. He was trying to be a hero and save us from ourselves, but it ended up being a tool of destruction. I think Kafka put it in. Kafka put Nietzsche's critique in the real lived experience. It was very powerful when I read Kafka. It's like, wow, he really got it.
Yeah, for those who don't know the background, in the rise to the genocide in Rwanda, radio stations got involved, and one radio jockey in particular would have these shows where he was constantly whipping up rage against the tribe that they were eventually going to commit genocide against, and he would on almost every show refer to them as cockroaches as part of his hate talk radio. And it has been widely analyzed, the role that played in getting the first tribe to commit genocide against the second tribe, as they were able to dehumanize them and not see them as real people.
The Hutsis and the Tutsis.
That's it. And I had never thought about the connection to Kafka's Metamorphosis before you just said that today, Phil. So thank you for that, because that's potent. And of course, both of those connect to the kind of language that the Nazis used about Germans and Romani and homosexuals and others that they wanted to eliminate. That game of replacing the concrete particular of actual human beings with an abstract universal of your own devising lends itself to being able to dehumanize people, because the act of abstraction itself contains the seeds of dehumanization. Even if you're trying to abstract someone in a good way, it's why so many Black people don't like the magical Negro stereotype. It's why so many Native Americans don't like the magical Indian stereotype. Is they're like, I don't want to be stereotyped at all, because if you're engaging in abstraction, it might be a good abstraction today, but you've already said it's okay to erase who I am and replace it with your story about who I am. And at that point, I'm in danger, because tomorrow you might be in a different mood and you might abstract me differently. And it's how Kenneth Smith keeps coming back to this Hegelian idea that to abstract is to be in error. And so Smith keeps coming back to the relationship between the word abstract and extract, that to abstract is to take a piece out and then to hold it up as a synecdoche that you claim stands for the whole, that you claim is a sufficient representation of the whole that you've left behind, with just this little piece that you're hanging on to. And so there is an act of violence involved in the abstract mind. And it's ironic, because so many millions of people over the centuries have thought that if people would just be reasonable, if they would just be rational, you hear these words all the time, if they would just be, intellectual and logical, then we would live in a good world. they don't see the connection between abstraction and violence. They don't see that every abstraction is at least a little bit a lie, and the part of the lie it is does a certain amount of violence to the actual world, erases it. And as anybody who's been on the marginalized end of the marginalized privileged relationship and social relations knows, to be erased is a precursor to people being able to abuse you with impunity, because now other people can't see what's happening to you because they don't even know you exist. All abstraction involves a certain amount of erasure. So I think Sharon and then Ayala.
I just want to comment on that, because that is where we are. You know, in our
Yes.
politics, if you're not one side or the other, then you're the enemy. And that's a form of abstraction, and that causes violence.
Yes.
Right? So a lot of the things we talk about here today, I reflect on the occurrences in the society in which we live today, and I can find applications.
Yes.
Well, what I wanted to say was, again, I'm the reader, where I'm at the bottom of page 194, and I think Phil just said that, did he say that Kant caused a lot of destruction? Because what I want to walk away from this discussion about Contra Kant is where we see the non-functioning or the dysfunctional side of Kant. So where is the functioning side? And there's this paragraph on the bottom of page 194, which I'll read again. It says, Kant, of course, has famously reduced morality in all forms, traditional, communal, and conventional, to ethics, rational and unregularized, and had reduced ethics to mere and pure deontology or theory of duty. And that's it. That in itself is a problem. Axiology, or the theory of values, he regarded as utterly irrational and idiosyncratic and incapable of being universalized. Well, that second part of the sentence was almost an inhibitor to decision making, because you're a rational thinking human being and you use your values and you use your experiences, which provides you with a value system to make decisions. To exclude that from any kind of imperatives is problematic. And that's the dysfunctional part of Kant's theories, I think.
Yes.
So now, where is the functional part of it? That's my question.
So I'm going to do an aside to answer that before I go back to Priya and Ayala, or Ayala and then Priya, who had other things that they wanted to talk about. Because once again, you're opening the most important can of worms there is here. This is the core thing with Kant is where is he strong and where is he weak? So about that, one thing to talk about is I put Ernst Cassirer in the chat. I've mentioned him in the past once or twice. He's a 20th century philosopher who was a neo-Kantian, Neoplatonist. And he was, in the same way that Kant was in some ways, like Phil was saying, rescuing Plato by trying to update him, Cassirer was trying to update Kant and as well as Plato. And one of the interesting arguments that Cassirer makes is that if we take Plato at his word, that the actual world we see isn't real, and only the world of idealized pure mathematical forms that he posits is real, then all kinds of problems result. So Plato literally is a major problem. But if we don't take him at his word, if we say that the world of actual forms may not be, the world of forms may not be how the actual world works, but maybe it is the way that the human mind works, that we think in terms of these idealized forms, even when the real world is different from them. He says, Cassirer says, then Plato becomes precious, because he really gives us a systematized way to understand the big difference between the way we think about the world and the way it actually is. That is, you just reposition Plato a little bit so that his forms aren't out here, but are in here, and suddenly he becomes potent again and healing. And there's some ways in which that's true for Kant as well. So Kant, I don't know if you know, Socrates has this quote that says that we have, as philosophers, we have a responsibility to do justice to the rights of the question. When a philosophical question or issue is brought before us, we have a duty to it. It's a sacred thing that we can't just blithely shoot from the hip about the most important things, which Heraclitus actually has a quote that says that. But that instead, we really owe it to nature and ourselves and the gods to be responsible in the way that we explore issues and questions. So from this perspective, you can see how what Kant is trying to do is do justice to Verstand, to noesis. He has taken noesis and Verstand as far probably as anybody could ever take it, and tried to systematize it and make it rigorous and say, in its own terms, looking at itself, what is its perspective? How does that look? So when we want to look at something intellectually, it's incredibly precious to be able to see what the strengths and weaknesses of that perspective are. Now, Kant was an advocate, so he's mostly telling us the strengths of that perspective. But even in that advocacy, he also reveals the weaknesses. Like when he says he doesn't really want to talk about the sub-rational bases of morality or truth. When he says that, what he's saying is, put another way, as his later critics said, this is something Verstand is weak at. And if you're going to pull Verstand out of your toolkit and use it, you need to know which problems it's good at and which ones it's bad at. So Kant is helping to give us that in the clearest possible form, especially once you augment it with his critics about the weaknesses. So I'd say that's Kant in a nutshell. If we've got two core faculties that we're born into and that we have to try to construct our better third faculty out of, then understanding one of them at this level of rigor and detail is a blessing. It's just that it becomes a trap if we then make it the master and try to become a monotheist about it and say, well, that's the only way our mind should work. That's when we get into trouble. But as with repositioning Plato, if we just reposition Kant and say, well, we don't agree with Kant that this is the only thing you should do, but this is one of the things you should do, and here's how you do it. Now we're talking. Now we're cooking. I think that's when Kant's strong. Does that make sense, Sharon? Okay. So then why don't I do Ayala and then Priya?
Because you packed so much here. As far as your last point of repositioning, not Kant, but Plato, it's not just that we do it because it's convenient, but because the other way is more accessible and compatible with our human experience. We as humans abstract all the time. When we see this chair and that chair, we call it chair. The form is a form of abstraction that is part of the human brain structure. Right. So that's, and the positivists clearly debated Plato's assertion of a form which is an objective truth that is non-accessible to us. So it's only the presentations that are accessible in our form of thinking. But I want to go back to the cockroach because I think he won the discussion today. And what is and then to Kierkegaard from there, as an example of Kierkegaard's distinction between the three zones or modes of thinking, which is the aesthetic, the ethics, and the existential, or what is. The cockroach, when even somebody mentions the word, triggers a reaction of disgust. It's the deep kind of reaction. So it is used in the reasoning process, in rationing, because it is okay to step and to call the exterminators to get rid of this disgusting, invasive, intruding, evil type of creature. As a matter of fact, this is looking, of course, from our human point of view. As a matter of fact, no, the cockroach is a good parent. They protect their caste, their offsprings very, very much, and even with their bodies. They are superior to humans in survival abilities. They adapt to everything. And they probably outlive humanity some point.
Yes.
Yeah. They hide very well. They don't care about us. They scare us and they disgust us. So they sure have some superiority over humans.
Yeah, they think we're gross. They clean themselves extensively after we touch them. They do. It's somebody pointed this out. You know, every time you touch a cockroach, if you can keep it on camera, it'll scuttle away and then wash itself meticulously from top to bottom. Like, that was disgusting.
Yeah, from all this intelligence bullshit, right? Okay, but here is my point that it is used. So the element of disgust is very often used to rationalize behavior that is unethical toward any life forms otherwise. So here we mix the ethics with the aesthetics and with what is. And that kind of important, I see it very important to live in all spheres of life, Priya. You know, the life of creativity and fun and imagination, and also in the reality and the harsh facts of what is, and also in the world of what should I do, what is the right thing to do, but to distinguish among them. Because the problem of humans is where we all mix them. And the cockroach is one example.
Thank you for that, Iowa. That was great. Priya and then Phil. Oh, you're on mute, Priya.
Sorry, I'm using my iPhone, so the buttons are small. Just going back to this cockroach idea, I feel sometimes we're living in the early 1900s, like we're 100 years back in like the political speak, and I've met somebody who was in a genocide. He was a survivor of the genocide, and it's exactly. He was basically just pulled out and isolated, and the whole process of dehumanizing, it doesn't just like happen. It takes time, and it begins with words. But I think people do become more rational, and it actually scares me when people are more rational, because I feel that they're letting go of their humanity. But I think though it's like the Maslow pyramid, where Kant is kind of like the bottom of the pyramid, where you need to survive before you thrive. You need that structure underneath, and that's where that is important. And as we kind of evolved as human beings, we got away from that survival aspect, and we're getting into more intellectual pursuits, and that's why I feel like we need Kant in order to give us that stable, like that rational aspect, because that we need to survive at the end of the day. That's what we need. We need to be alive. But in order for life to be of quality, that's where that higher part of that Maslow's pyramid kind of comes in. You can't build that pyramid without that basis.
Yeah, this is where the quote comes into play that says that, intellect and reason make spectacular servants, but they make terrible masters. And an example of the value as a servant of systematized thinking is how much checklists have done to prevent or reduce the rate of aircraft crashes and to reduce the rate of errors in surgery in
Yes.
both medicine and and I guess, rocketry as well. But I mean, basically in complex transportation endeavors and complex medical endeavors, checklists and systematizing them and best practices have saved countless measurable lives. So as a servant, it's spectacular. You absolutely need it and want it. But when you try to put it in charge, you discover what Kant tacitly admitted and what his critics openly critiqued him for, which is that intellect is not a reliable source of guidance about right and wrong, for example. It's just not. It's too vulnerable to what your a priori premises were. And if you have the wrong a priori premises, if they're off even just a little bit, the process of deducing things from those premises, of laying out the logical conclusions, will sooner or later take you to atrocities and horrors.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Just wanted to say that, like, you see this a lot in like religions and cultural practices where people will, in order to make their own community more distinct, they create like perhaps food, like we don't eat this, we don't wear this, we don't say this, and those people that do, they're disgusting, and we don't want any part of it. And you see this like over and over again, this like playbook of defying a community by making the other the other.
Yes, the checklist version of identity. I am these things and I'm not these things. Check, check, check.
Yeah, I saw that a lot this past year, where people were upset about people's eating practices and things like that, and it's just any type of difference, even the smallest difference, people just jump on, and that's a great way to make a cohesive community, but what kind of community are you creating?
Yeah, exactly. It leads to all kinds of problems. Thank you for that, Priya. Phil, and then we'll work on our wrap up for today. So go ahead, Phil.
Okay, like I'm going to try to answer that question about what's good about Kant.
Yes.
But in a limited way, because it's a relationship to art, which is something I know. But even that's kind of limited. It's like, in that sense, I'm actually a committed Kantian in this sense, but with limitations. I see it as a kind of mixed doubles game in which Hume was a deconstructionist and Kant was the formalist that tried to keep order. You could say that's a relationship between Tefnut and the other guy. I forgot his name.
Right.
But this is a strange mixed double because
tennis game?
What?
Tennis?
Yeah, mixed doubles in tennis. But Kant is also playing on the other side. Okay. He's and that would be the versus the romantics and the impressionists. Okay. In this case, the impressionists were the deconstructionists and Kant was the formalist. Okay. Which put things in order. And I think that the tension between those two was in the 19th century to produce essentially the 20th century. What happened was, let's see, Hume was important because he liberated us from the old tradition, because all things is based on just like habit and tradition and all that. And so that was important for the romantics to get a grounding, to imagine a new possibilities, okay? And Kant was like, no, we can't go 100% this way. We got to have a formal tension, the whole thing's together, okay? So in that sense, he was a heroic part, at least restraining the chaos in relationship to the order, which is a tension that was necessary. And when the romantics on the other side, you drift to the other side, the impressionists were creating a new system of understanding that actually come out of Kant about wearing rose-colored glasses, you know, and it's through to experience of the world. And you're going to see you can't get to the metaphysics without experiencing the world because they're tied together. And in fact, the way you see the world is very different than what the Renaissance see it. You know, in fact, it's just an experience of blobs and you put together and construct. And then Kant was the, well, no. That's a formalist. And in a sense, you could say Kant was kind of like Cézanne, right? A kind of formal impressionist, that he wanted to be impressionist, but he also needed order. He wasn't going to go out there and let's just feel it all and see what it is. And that led to, in a sense, modernism in the sense of Picasso, which was the mix between the formalism, but a deconstructive formalism that allowed for new possibility, new aspect to synthesize, in a sense, this mix. And of course, early modernism, you also had the Dadaists, who also was going to criticize and break this up, okay? But the weakness of Kant finally showed through, because anytime you create a structure, it began as a form, but it became a kind of religion.
Yeah.
And we have God, these names, I should know this, but Mondrian, he became the high priest, if not the god, at least the high priest of modernism, right? And so everything has to be this ordered geometric form that, in a sense, progress, you could say progress as civilization went through in this sort of more chaotic, creative, opening up a possibility to this more tightened formalism that, in a sense, resolved in late modernism, which, like I said, I went to New York and all I saw was everybody invented the grid. Like,
yes.
In the most sophisticated world and art in the world, like everybody invented, I was like, wow, is this possible? That's simultaneous discovery. So in a sense, then you led to postmodernism, okay, which in a sense was a reenaction of Dada. So in this sense, like, I think from the world of art, he held things together temporarily. But the thing is, once it became held together, it hardens into a religion, which prevented it from growing, expanding into possibility. That's a critique of Kant that I have in art. But I am rigorous in my defense of Kant in that sense. He held things together from it, in a sense. Otherwise, you're gonna have somebody like what's his name, that the famous composer from the 19th century. Say I forgot now. You know, Wagner. Okay.
Yes.
Otherwise, you have Wagner and go on. It's gone too far. Okay.
Yes.
So in that sense, you have too much Wagner and not enough constraint of romanticism. So in some sense, I think Kant was important as a kind of like signpost that, in a sense, held the backwaters from rushing in too fast so it could develop, which is in some ways related to the Egyptian relationship between the nature and the building structure. So I think in that sense, he was important in that early part of the 20th, late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, to hold the forms together so it could continue, so the city could continue. That's why I like Kant. I certainly could have criticized him, but I think he was important. So that was the good part.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Phil.
At least
Can I just have one quick comment? Because that was the way I looked. Because in the first Contra Kant paper that we read, those were the first two premises that he said why Kant came up with his philosophy against Humean psychologism and Newtonian physical determinism. So I understand what Phil says about trying to hold things together, right? And then it became entrenched, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right. It's really interesting when you look at it too, in terms of before Kant, we really had no way to know that you couldn't make a solid epistemological and ethical basis out of intellect, out of reason. I mean, even up through the 20th century, we've got Spock on Star Trek being portrayed as a Vulcan. He is able to be more civilized than Earthlings are because he's logical. And he sees many things that Earthlings do wrong. He's like, if only you people were logical, you'd be good. And in this, he's a representation of Kantianism, right? The faith that if we just thought things through enough, we would be better people and better behaved. And it is true that there are a host of problems that can be solved with reason. It's just that they can't all be solved. And the thing is that Achilles heel of reason, that it can't actually solve all the things that it thinks it can solve. That's the mistake it makes, is the hubris, the overreach, the belief that it is not only necessary, but the belief that it's sufficient. That we would not have known if Kant had not tried to make that argument, because he made that argument about as well as it could be made. And it took decades and decades of follow-up philosophers to critique him and figure out why this wasn't so. It just wasn't obvious why that wasn't so. We needed somebody to try that path and show us, how far can you take this, and what's the good that comes out of it and what's the bad that comes out of it. He made possible an enormous amount of philosophical fertility that followed by establishing such a clear description of one of the possibilities. And what's interesting, Mahbub talks in the chat there about Kierkegaard, and his critique of reason as what he sees as beyond reason, and why there needs to be something beyond reason so that reason can be a good servant and not a master. He talks about Kierkegaard's respect for the individual instead of the abstract category as being the central focus point of ethics and epistemology. And that's all great stuff, Mahbub. You're right on the money. And what's interesting, when your two middle comments, what's interesting is the extent to which Hegel is trying to critique Kant, while at the same time is doing so in a hyper-intellectual way. He is in a hyper-intellectual way accusing Kant of being too hyper-intellectual. And that's why he talks about Begriff. That's why he talks about Vernunft. He's talking about these other modes of thought, but he himself doesn't use them in his arguments. He describes them and describes their necessity, but he still argues in a strictly Verstand way, which is fascinating, right? That Kant had such a potent impact that even his critics at first thought, if I want to critique Kant, I have to do so in a Kantian way. It's like that was the impact of the guy. That it was so profound. It's not until you get to Kierkegaard and Nietzsche that you read philosophers who are sort of gratuitously rejecting a Kantian approach to critiquing Kant.
Okay.
Because if you read Marx, it's going to read the same way as Hegel. It's hyper-intellectualized, extremely dry critiques of where Kant went wrong with his over-intellectualization, written in an over-intellectualized way. I mean, I don't know how much Marx people have read, but the Communist Manifesto, let me assure you, is an exception. Most of it reads like Hegel and Kant, which is wild for someone who's trying to critique that stuff. But that's why when you pick up Nietzsche, it's so shocking. We'll talk about Nietzsche next time, since we've done Kierkegaard this time. It's why Nietzsche is so shocking, because he chucks the Kantian approach to critiquing Kant and just, does the dancing, joyful vitality, I embrace Begriff and life and nature, ha ha ha, keep up with me if you can approach, which, people did not know what to make of that. So we'll pick that up next time.
Very good.
That Nietzsche was like that because he was going crazy, perhaps?
No, that's been postulated a lot, but it's pretty well refuted. His break with sanity was abrupt. As tempting as it is to read it into the earlier work, it was like night and day. It was over a course of just a couple of weeks. And at the end of that break, he himself could not understand what he'd written and took no interest in it. It was just like he snapped.
That's very sad.
Yeah. And he wasn't the first in his family for that to happen to. So he had some kind of congenital situation that finally kicked in. But certainly, even if he hadn't gone crazy later, his stuff reads crazy in the history of philosophical tradition. People just did not write like that. critique like that. So we'll get into that next week.
Well, just looking at his beard will tell you something is unusual about him.
Yeah, he was an unusual
even
guy.
as a philosopher.
Yeah, no question.
I learned a lot today. Thank you.
Thank you,
Sharon.
Thank you, Rick. Thank
Thanks.
you, David.
Well, yeah, thank you. Thank you to everybody.
Yes, yes, yes. I learned a lot today. Thanks a lot.
All right, next week, same time.
Okay. All right. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.